Hey,
Good to see you all.
Aloha.
Aloha, aloha. Oh, a lot of hey, Nancy, Jen Sadiqian, how are you? Hey, Britt, good to see you again too. Wonderful. We're going to do things a little differently today. Hi, Ellie and Lynn Kelsey and Regina, my sister with the beautiful fall background. And I said Ellie, yep. And Phil's here. Oh gosh, lots of folks. That's great. We're going to do things a little bit differently this evening than we have. Because this is, we're marking the centenary of the ascension of Abdul Baha. Our devotion today is going to be a bit longer, and it's all focused on Abdul Baha. And for our presentation this evening, several of you have volunteered to help read, and we really appreciate that. So when you see the number in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, that's when you'll read, when that slide comes up, and all of the slides are numbered, so you can follow and know when to step in and come off mute. Again, we ask everyone to stay on mute. During the devotion and the presentation, the chat will be closed. And after Kim's presentation, of course, we'll have questions and answers. Hi, Lawrence. Hi, Yolanda. Yolanda, could I ask you to read slide number 2? Okay, thank you. I miscounted today, so I was one off. All right. So I think that's it. Let me just start again and welcome everybody. We're just delighted to have you here. It's a busy week. Thanksgiving, the Day of the Covenant, which is Abdul Baha's birthday. And but we celebrated his Day of the Covenant, and then of course the ascension of Abdul Baha. It's also a time of mourning for our Indigenous brothers and sisters as well. It's not a celebration. They're not thankful for historically, what has happened to them. So rather than bring up those slides again, because we're focusing on Abdul Baha today, you're invited to go ahead and put those ancestors, spiritual as well as those of blood, in the chat, to acknowledge them, to bring them to mind, to invite them to join us, as well as identify your Indigenous territory if you know it, and also put that in the chat. That will be open while I'm going through these little introductory things before we get started today. One of the first things I'd like to do is thank you all for coming. Because of course, without you, well, we'd just be sitting here looking at ourselves. Although I admit we have a good time in the back end. And I'd like to thank Jillian and Nason Sturdivant. That's the tech team. That's the rest of the Racial Healing Justice team. And we also have a new member, unofficially, but she's done these wonderful graphics announcing Kim's talk and the next one that's coming up as well on our Facebook page, and you'll see it when you get the email notice. But that's Mashallah. And Mashallah, if you're here in the room, I saw you come in. I'm glad you're here. Make sure we can see you and wave at folks. We'd like to thank you for that beautiful work. She is a phenomenal, phenomenal artist. And so these are the folks that are really making this happen for us. And they're all just a delight to work with. So I want to thank them. And of course, Kim Kelsey, who's going to deliver a very thorough discussion on white ideology and how we can move past that. So having said those things, I'm going to pause just for a moment. We're going to start the devotional. I just received this earlier this afternoon, and it's a transmittal from our National Spiritual Assembly on behalf of the Universal House of Justice, and it's that Supreme Body's tribute to Abdul Baha on the occasion of the commemoration of the centenary of his ascension. A century has now elapsed since the noble spirit of Abdul Baha ascended to its eternal home. His birth had coincided with the dawn of the faith's heroic age, and his passing signaled the setting of the sun upon its final epoch. No clearer demonstration could be imagined of how he embodied the forces of unity than the sight of his funeral, at which a vast crowd of mourners from every creed in this land came together to grieve their common loss. In his day, so many of the friends who embraced the faith absorbed the spirit of the divine teaching simply by observing him. Still today, if we wish to align our lives with that same spirit, we look to the example set by the Master, whose word indeed reflected the brilliance of the light that shone from Baha'u'llah's revelation. In every respect, his example is central to Baha'i identity. Every Baha'i may turn to him to understand better how to diffuse the light of the faith and for a model to follow as we seek to awaken spiritual susceptibilities in those we encounter. His own counsel that the teacher must be fully enkindled so that his utterance may exert influence and yet be totally self-effaced and evanescent, so that he may teach with the melody of the concourse on high, is vividly realized in the unnumbered accounts of souls transformed by being in the company of Abdul Baha. Countless are the lessons to be learned from how he presented the divine precepts to every kind of person, constantly widening the circle of unity, without regard for any outward dissimilarities of appearance, language, custom, or belief. The universality of his love produced a community that, even at that time, could justly claim to be a cross-section of society. His love revived, nurtured, inspired. It banished estrangement and welcomed all to the banquet table of the Lord. Every community building endeavor undertaken today, every educational activity, and every outreach carries with it the hope of communicating through our own efforts a token of the same love he showered upon every soul. Such efforts are the best tribute that can be rendered to him at this centenary and every day that follows. Can start.
A long time ago, long before you were born, in 1912, Abdul Baha visited America. While he was on his trip to America, he spoke to many different people, women and men and children. He went to many cities, to churches and temples and universities, and parks and meetings and houses, to tell people about the Baha'i Faith. He spoke to young people and old people, rich people and poor people, white people and black people. He told them all about Baha'u'llah. Wherever Abdul Baha went, many Baha'is went with him. They were Baha'is of all kinds, Persians in Persian clothes, Americans in American clothes, and rich Baha'is and poor Baha'is, and old Baha'is and young Baha'is, and all colors, caramel and ebony and peach and honey and porcelain and copper. Once, while Abdul Baha was in New York, he went to a place called the Bowery. Many Baha'is went to the Bowery with Abdul Baha. As they walked down the street, some people stared at them because they were so different. Soon some of the children started shouting and laughing. They thought it was funny to see so many different kinds of people together. Some of the boys called names and some even threw sticks at Abdul Baha and the Baha'is that walked down the streets. Mrs. Kinney was one of the Baha'is with Abdul Baha. Abdul Baha was staying at her house in New York. It made her sad to see the boys laughing and shouting at Abdul Baha and his friends, so she went over to speak to the children. She told the boys who Abdul Baha was. She said that he was a very holy man. He had spent many years in prison and had suffered very much, just because he told the truth and loved all people. Now he was going to a meeting to tell people about Baha'u'llah. The boys were sorry for what they had done. "Can't we go to the meeting too?" they asked. "No," Mrs. Kinney said, "not today." But since Abdul Baha was staying at her house, they could come there on Sunday to meet him. She gave the boys her address, but she didn't really think they would come. When Sunday came, the children arrived at Mrs. Kinney's house, dressed up in their very best clothes. She was surprised to see them, but she was very happy that they had come to meet Abdul Baha. All the boys came into the house. They went up the stairs and walked into a very large room. Abdul Baha was standing at the door. He was smiling and laughing because he liked the children very much. He met each one of the boys as they came into his room. He shook their hands and put his arm around their shoulders. His smiles and laughter made them all very happy. The last child to come into the room was a black boy. When Abdul Baha saw him, he was even happier than before. In a loud voice full of joy and love, he said that here was a black rose. Abdul Baha said these words because he was so happy to see the last little boy. And this made the little boy very happy too. In nature, no black roses grow. Most roses are red or yellow or pink or white. But people imagine black roses and say that if there ever were a black rose, it would be the most beautiful flower of all. Abdul Baha loved to be with children of different colours. That is why he was so happy to see the last little boy who came into the room, because he was different from all the others. While the children were in his room, Abdul Baha brought in a large box of chocolates. He knew that most little children love chocolate. He gave every child as many chocolates as they could hold in their hands. The little boys surely never forgot their visit with Abdul Baha, and they surely never forgot what Abdul Baha had shown them. People of all kinds and of all colours are beautiful.
This story of Abdul Baha illustrates an important principle of Baha'i life: the love, respect and appreciation of human diversity, and that black people are like the pupil of the eye, bringing light to the world of humanity. The Baha'i teachings do not ask us to ignore racial and ethnic differences, but rather that we should seek out and enjoy the fruits of intercultural fellowship, friendship and sharing. A Baha'i should value and cherish intercultural experiences and make them a part of their daily life. It should be pointed out that Abdul Baha did not simply ignore the fact that the last child to come into the room was of a different ethnicity than the others, and he did not behave as if this difference was of no importance. No, he announced the beauty of this diversity and emphasized it with such love and joy that no one can mistake his purpose. Abdul Baha wrote, "Baha'u'llah hath said that the various races of humankind lend a composite harmony and beauty of colour to the whole. Let all associate, therefore, in this great human garden, even as flowers grow and bind together, side by side, without discord or disagreement between them."
Time to sign and drive. Hurry in during the Volkswagen Sign and Drive event and listen only 20.
Abdul Baha, I'm far from home. The road is dark, I'm all alone. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, be the my guide. When I am weak, stay by my side. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, dearest friend, help me to reach my journey's end. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, hear me I pray. Oh, help me lest I go astray. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, I shall not fear when I am sure that thou art near. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, dearest friend, help me to reach my journey's end. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, I'm far from home. The road is dark, I'm all alone. Hold the my hand, hold the my hand. Abdul Baha, dearest friend, help me to reach my journey's end. Hold the my hand, hold down my hand. Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha.
There was a man from far away. He was the son of the greatest name. He taught us all how to love each other. He showed us all the righteous way. The perfect example. The great greatest servant of all, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha. Like a flame burning in the dark, he lit the way, he showed me the path, and everywhere he went, he showed love to all. Attracted the hearts of men to heed his father's call. The perfect example. The greatest servant of all. Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha. He taught me how to love, he taught me how to teach. He's everything that I look up to, he's everything that I need. He taught me how to love, he taught me how to teach. He's everything that I look up to, he's everything that I need. He taught me how to love, he taught me how to teach. He's everything that I look up to, he's everything that I need. He taught me how to love, he taught me how to teach. He's everything that I look up to, he's everything that Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha. Taught me how to love, taught me how to teach. He's everything that I look up to. Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha, Abdul Baha.
نام من عبدالبها، ذات من عبدالبها، صفت من عبدالبها، حقیقت من عبدالبها، ستایش من عبدالبها. زیرا عبودیت جمال مبارک اکلیل جلیل من است و خدمت کل بشر آیین دیرین من. از فضل و عنایت جمال مبارک عبدالبها رایت صلح اکبر است که در اوج اعلا موج زند و به موهبت اسم اعظم مصباح سلام عام است که به نور محبت الله درخشد. منادی ملکوت است تا شرق و غرب را بیدار نماید و صوت دوستی و راستی و حقیقت پرستی و آشتی است که ولوله در آفاق انداخته و هیچ اسمی و رسمی و ذکری و نعتی جز عبدالبها ندارد و نخواهد داشت. این است آرزوی من و این است اوج اعلای من و این است غایت قصوای من و این است حیات ابدیه من و این است عزت سرمدیه من.
While Abdul-Baha was living in a Paris hotel, among those who often came to see him was a poor black man. He was not a Baha'i, but he loved Abdul-Baha very much. One day when he came to visit, someone told him that the management did not like to have him, a poor black man, come because it was not consistent with the standards of the hotel. The poor man went away. When Abdul-Baha learnt of this, he sent for the man responsible. He told him that he must find his friend. He was not happy that he should have been turned away. Abdul-Baha said, "I did not come to see expensive hotels or furnishings, but to meet my friends. I did not come to Paris to conform to the customs of Paris, but to establish the standard of Baha'u'llah." This story shows that we all have a role to play in breaking the chains of oppression within our spheres of influence. We must not fall into the blind imitation of society's standards, but rather elevate ourselves to conform to a divine standard, which is the only means to bring about true unity. We must be sensitive and have our eyes and ears open to the social discord around us, and reflect on where we stand in the grand scheme of things. For we could be unwitting beneficiaries of an ongoing oppressive system. We could be perpetrators of hate and racism, or we could very well be the victims of an unjust system. Either way, regardless of where we stand, we have to examine our biases and the preconceived notions we have developed in our lives. It is not enough to say we are not racist. Rather, we all have to be active agents of change. It is not enough for just one race to make the effort, or for just the affected to address the situation. The unity of the world is within the influence of all of our actions, no matter how small. Let neither think that the solution of so vast a problem is a matter that exclusively concerns the other.
عبدالبهاست، صفت من عبدالبهاست، حقیقت من عبدالبهاست، نعت من عبدالبهاست، رقیت به جمال قدم، اکلیل جلیل و تاج وهاج من است. و خدمت به نوع انسان آیین قدیم من، نه اسمی دارم نه لقبی، نه ذکری خواهم نه نعتی، جز عبدالبها، جز عبدالبها. این است آرزوی من، این است اعظم آمال من، این است حیات ابدی من، این است عزت سرمدی من.
My name is Abdul Baha. My qualification is Abdul Baha. My reality is Abdul Baha. My praise is Abdul Baha. Blessed perfection is my glorious and refulgent diadem, and servitude to all the human race, my perpetual religion. No name, no title, no mention, no commendation have I, nor will ever have except no name, no title,
As ye have faith, so shall your powers and blessings be. This is the balance, this is the balance, this is the balance. As ye have faith, so shall your powers and blessings be. This is the balance, this is the balance, this is the balance. I am with you always, whether living or dead. I am with you until the end. I am with you always. I am with you. I am with you. I am with you until the end. As ye have faith, so shall your powers and blessings be. This is the balance, this is the balance, this is the balance. As ye have faith, so shall your powers and blessings be. This is the balance, this is the balance, this is the balance. I am with you always, whether living or dead. I am with you until the end. I am with you always, whether living or dead. I am with you. I am with you. I am with you until the end. As ye have faith, so shall your powers and blessings be. This is the balance, this is the balance, this is the balance.
Thank you. That's my sister. So beautiful. Thank you so much. It brought me to tears. And if you'd like to know more about Abdul Baha, just ask anybody. There's so much to say. And I'm so grateful to have received that message from the Universal House of Justice today, because I struggled. How am I going to introduce Abdul Baha before these videos? There's no way I could have done anything befitting his station. And as being unique in religious history, he is not a prophet, he is not a manifestation of God, but he is the master, the exemplar, the standard that we strive to obtain to. And I'm so grateful for that, and for my sister to provide such a lovely voice and rendition of that for all of us. Thank you very much, friends. Okay, you know, this is such a beautiful, soft, warm space. I really don't want to move on just yet. And I'm delighted to see so many smiling faces and touched hearts here in the room with us. And I do have to do a shout out. Oh, he's gone and left, gone somewhere. Okay, I'll catch him later. But a friend of mine, some of you know, from Chile is with us today. And so when I see him back in here again at an appropriate time, I'll call him out. But he's been a home front pioneer to Chile for over 40 years, and he has never left his post. That is his commitment to spreading the message of Baha'u'llah. So, having said that, let me go ahead and introduce Kim Kelsey. She is going to address us today on such an important topic about the reality of the world in which we live, how we've come to be there, and how we can change this. So a little bit about Kim. Get to that just a second. Okay. She is a family therapist and a licensed clinical social worker. She recently spent 2 years providing end-of-life care as a medical social worker with York Hospital Hospice. She taught a graduate course on race, culture, and oppression at University of New Hampshire for many years, and is grateful for the early influence of her father, Jack Remiganati, and her uncle, Nathan Bretstein, for inspiring her abiding interest in issues of social justice. She also serves on the board of directors for the Pine Tree Institute, a local nonprofit agency which is undertaking a major initiative focused on community-based resilience and trauma-informed care. Wow. She and her husband live in Elliott, Maine, and recently welcomed their 11th grandchild. Wow, again. Kim, we are delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us this weekend. And we are going to turn it over to you. We have some readers. So again, readers, the slides are numbered. And you should have gotten an email from me inviting you to speak on a particular slide. So with that, let me turn it over to Kim, and chat is closed, folks.
Okay.
Kim.
Well, thank you. It is really an honor to be here tonight with so many people from so many different places, and I'm very excited. And I didn't know when I had written back to Sherilyn months ago that I would end up doing my presentation on this holy day. So it's also an honor to be here tonight. And much of the presentation tonight will focus on Baha'u'llah's teachings and how Abdu'l-Baha, in his visits to America, taught us how to bring those into action by his actions. So it was beautiful to have the devotions on Abdu'l-Baha, and I feel like ready to go now and talk about this important subject. So, but before we start, I want to contextualize myself as a presenter on this subject, because I am a white woman who grew up in the United States, and I am the beneficiary of privilege associated with that. And that's something that I am aware of, and something that I know that I have to maintain awareness of and figure out how that places me in the work that needs to be done in this country and in our faith. I grew up in a Baha'i home, which I felt was such an honor. And so from the very beginning, I was exposed to multiracial gatherings in our home, in our Baha'i community, not far from the Wilhelm properties in Teaneck, New Jersey, where I went to Sunday school as a Baha'i child and had friends of other races. The town that I grew up in, Washington Township, was all white. So my elementary school experience was white, white students, white faculty. Our janitor was an African-American man who everybody in the school just adored. But then when I got to junior high, a couple towns came together in a consolidated school system. So then I was in an integrated school system for junior high and high school, and very much appreciated that experience. My circle of friends became friends with African-American students, and many of them actually became interested in the Baha'i faith, came to firesides in our home. Some of them became Baha'is. So I feel very blessed to have had that experience, unlike many of my peers. it was mentioned that I wanted to just honor both my father, Jack Remignanti, and my uncle, Nat Rutstein, for their early influences on me. My father was a bit of an introvert, but quite a book lover. And so our home was filled with all sorts of books on the subject of race, such as, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And just seeing these books on the shelf has an influence on a young person. And many of them I did read, the autobiography of Malcolm X. So in addition to my Baha'i teachings, I had these firsthand biographies to read and studies to read. So I'm very grateful to my father for that. And many people know that Nathan Rutstein, my uncle, wrote many books on the subject of race, and started this Institute for the Healing of Racism back in the 70s. And I think anybody who knew him knew that when you were with him, you always felt seen. And I think that's such a key element to the work that we have to do as Baha'is and as people trying to heal racism, is to allow other people to be seen. That's the primary quality. And that's something that he exhibited very sort of naturally. So I'm grateful for that. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about my background. I am what I'm not. I'm not a historian by training, educational training, and I'm not a sociologist, but I have great interest in those subjects. I am a social worker, and I have a keen interest in social justice issues, always have. And I like to see how systems work together, both on a micro level and a macro level, to go from undevelopment to development, and from maybe pathological systems to healthier systems. And that's what I will try to integrate in my presentation today. So, and I'm very appreciative that some people are happy to read. I just also, before we start with the slides, I want to say, I think it was mentioned that I'm zooming in from Elliott, Maine. Many of you have probably been to Elliott because of Greenacre Baha'i School, which is just down the road from where I live. But the town of Elliott is on the homeland of the Abenaki people, who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. And according to tribal oral tradition, the Abenaki are among the original inhabitants who lived in this place now called Maine for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. And the Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people called the Wabanaki, which means people of the dawn, whose wisdom and contribution is humbly honored from my perspective tonight. So, okay, so we can start the slides now. Jillian's going to be my slide forwarder, so I'm very appreciative of that, I don't have to be pushing buttons while we're going.
And just before you start, we forgot an announcement.
Okay.
We do have closed caption and transcripts provided. So if you need to use those, that is accessible now, and we have that available to you. Did I miss anything on that, Nason? He's coming off mute.
Nope, that should be it. If you need to disable them, it's on the button at the bottom there for live transcript. Or
okay, thank you. Sorry, Kim, please go right ahead.
No problem. So the title of this is Exploring Foundations of White Supremacy Ideology and Advancing Frameworks of Oneness and Justice. So Jillian, you can go to the first slide, which I'm going to read because it's one of my very favorite quotations. And I'm sure in many of the presentations that you've had over the months that you have shared this one from Baha'u'llah, where he says to us, "Know ye not why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how ye were created. Since we have created you all from one same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest." Next slide, please.
O Son of Spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom, if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid, thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and a sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes.
So both of these quotations emphasize that racial oppression is built on the myth of racial hierarchy. The oneness of mankind is foundational to the teachings of the Baha'i Faith. And here we are called in both of these quotations to ponder these truths with our hearts, not just in our brains, but with our hearts, and then work at aligning our actions accordingly. So tonight we'll examine the origins of the framework of racial hierarchy and talk about who benefited from this racial hierarchy and how do we work to dismantle it. So actually, before we go to the next slides, the next two slides are on this important document that we're going to start about learning about, called the Doctrine of Discovery. And somebody's going to read the next two slides on that. But I want to say that I personally never learned about the Doctrine of Discovery in my public school education. I never heard about it in college, and I didn't even hear about it when I went to graduate school, even though part of social work education is learning about racial hierarchy and racial oppression. But I didn't know about this doctrine. And I think probably many people in the audience would likely say the same thing. And I think if you went out and polled your family and friends, a lot of people would report not knowing what this doctrine is. But I think it's important that we understand this historical document and how it shaped the foundation of exploration and conquest in the world, and understand how it created our present day social realities. So if we can go to the next slide, and the reader's going to read 3 and 4. Tell us a little bit about this.
The Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery, formalized in the edicts of the popes, papal bulls of the 13th and 14th centuries, specified that the entire world was under the jurisdiction of the Pope as God's representative on earth. Any land not Christianized, i.e., not under the sovereignty of a Christian ruler, could be possessed on behalf of God. All time and space was considered empty until Christians arrived with God's truth. Until then, it was terra nullius, nobody's land. Previously, it existed in a dark, wild, and timeless existence of absolutely no significance. The papal bulls gave Columbus, Cortez, Pizarro, Cook, Hudson, and the rest both legal and moral license to do whatever they wanted to the people and lands they encountered, including dispossession, enslavement, and murder. They were granted free and ample faculty to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, countries, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profits.
Okay, very wordy and very shocking to our intellect at this point, but very much a sign of the times. And I think we can very much consider that this doctrine of discovery is much more of an aberration of Christ's teachings and biblical theology, because we know the Old Testament says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to say a few things about the next one. So I consider this, and most of us would consider these teachings a spiritually untenable framework, but the overall purpose of these efforts was to accumulate wealth by engaging in unlimited resource extraction, particularly mining, within the traditional territories of indigenous nations and peoples. The text of Romanus Pontifex is illustrative of the doctrine or right of discovery. Centuries of destruction and ethnocide resulted from the application of the doctrine of discovery and the framework of dominance to indigenous people and to their lands, territories, and resources. And we know that, longstanding Christian theology notes that the 7 deadly sins are lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. And you will see most of these at work in the application of this doctrine. And then I wanted just to mention a few other resources. I recently read this little book, quite a good one, called America's Racial Karma, An Invitation to Heal by Larry Ward. And he's an African-American author and a mindfulness instructor. And this is what he says about the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery established, well, he calls it a religious scandal, which I think is very appropriate. The doctrine of discovery established a spiritual, political, and legal justification for the colonization and seizure of land not inhabited by Christians. That definition released soldiers, ministers, missionaries, and merchants across the world to colonize others, imagining this as the fulfillment of their life's glory. What makes this a religious scandal is that it's a lie about the sacred nature of a human being. It denies the reverence for life at the heart of all religions, that the divine is embodied in all humans, including those who don't look like me. That's a lie about the cosmos. So that's his very descriptive language. And then some of you are familiar with Timothy Snyder. He's an American author and historian, and he calls this the big lie. We've heard that term around other things. And I like to think of this as selective spiritual consciousness. And I think I'll come back to that term as we move ahead, and what's the implications of that. So if we can go to the next slide, and I have some readers for the next two. Is somebody assigned to read 6 and 7? I could do it if there's nobody going to read it.
It was me.
Okay, all right.
Your host.
Okay.
Voices of Opposition to Oppression. Bartolomé de las Casas, 1484 to 1566. Arriving as one of the first Spanish and European settlers in the Americas, Las Casas initially participated in, but eventually felt compelled to oppose the abuses committed by colonists against the Native Americans. As a result, in 1515, he gave up his Indian slaves in Cano Media and advocated before King Charles I of Spain on behalf of rights for the natives.
Go ahead to the next one, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Bartolomé spent 50 years of his life actively fighting slavery and the colonial abuse of indigenous peoples, especially by trying to convince the Spanish court to adopt a more humane policy of colonization. Unlike some other priests who sought to destroy the indigenous people's native book and writings, he strictly opposed this action. His passionate appeals fell largely on deaf ears. Las Casas is often considered to be one of the first advocates for a universal conception of human rights.
Okay, we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to share one of his writings before we actually look at what was integral in creating a spiritual awakening for him, because he went, as many others did, with the thought of enriching himself and exploring and having adventure. But this is what he wrote to the crown heads of Spain. He wrote, and this was in 1542. So after quite a bit of time that he had been mostly on the island of Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This subject was not able, speaking of himself, to contain himself from the terrible things that the tyrants did invent, pursue, and have committed against these peaceable, humble, and meek Indian people who offend no person. Into and among these gentle sheep, endowed by their maker and creator with all the qualities aforesaid, did creep the Spaniards, who no sooner had knowledge of these people that they became like fierce wolves and tigers and lions who have gone many days without food or nourishment. And no other thing have they done for 40 years until this day, and still today see fit to do, but dismember, slay, perturb, afflict, torment, and destroy the Indians by all manner of cruelty, new and diverse and most singular manners, such as never before seen or read of or heard of, some few of which shall be recounted below. And they do this to such a degree that on the island of Hispaniola, of the above 3 million souls that we once saw, today there will be no more than 200 of those native people remaining. Statistics show that he was probably off with the estimate of 3 million, but they do think when Columbus first arrived that there were about 1 million of the Taino Indians on the island, and they were systematically destroyed in the efforts of the Spaniards to extract gold, basically from them with using their labor. But he did have a spiritual awakening shortly after he arrived. Really, he was a man of conscience, and I think we have to look at these voices, that there have always been voices of opposition throughout this tremendously sad period of oppression. But he read the book of Sirach, which is what we know now as the book of Ecclesiastics, and these were the things that stood out to him to say that what was happening was not God's will. So under this book, it says, the bread of the needy is their life. He that defraudeth him thereof is a man of blood. And he that taketh away his neighbor's living slayeth him. And he that defraudeth the labor of his hire is a bloodshedder. And when one buildeth and another pulleth down, what profit have they but then but labor? When one prayeth and another curseth, whose voice will the Lord hear? He that washeth himself after the touching of a dead body, if he touch it again, what availeth his washing? So we see that this particular man was able to see with his own eyes and hear with his own ears and look, and not through the eyes of others, which is what Baha'u'llah asks us to do in this day and age. And we are not hopefully witnessing the slaughter of people in the numbers that this man witnessed, but we do see daily examples of people's being oppressed and prejudices and, very painful, traumatic experiences for marginalized people in our country. So he's a good example of somebody that spoke up and spoke out at his own risk. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a little bit, I want to take a little segue here and talk about the dynamics underlying the culture that we're discussing here and exploring. And this is from the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders. And it describes something that probably most of you are familiar with at this point. It's called narcissistic personality disorder. So these descriptors are basically when we're looking at an individual pathology, but they absolutely can be transferred to cultural narcissism. So I just want to look at these first. And I think probably many people in this room know somebody who fits this description. People are not born with this. It usually develops over a period of time, sometimes from early trauma, but sometimes just also from early entitlement and, being spoiled or being allowed to think that you're more important than others, and that message getting repeated over time. So we think of narcissistic personality disorder as a pervasive pattern of grandiosity in either fantasy or behavior, the need for admiration, a lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. So these are not all, there's 9 criteria, but these are the main ones that I wanted to highlight. So somebody who struggles with this, well, they don't necessarily struggle. Somebody who has this personality disorder has a grandiose sense of self-importance. Like they exaggerate their achievements, talents, expect to be recognized as superior without commensurate achievements, has a sense of entitlement, which is the unreasonable expectation of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations, they are interpersonally exploitive, i.e. takes advantage of others to achieve his or her own ends, and also must lack empathy, unwilling to recognize or identify with the feelings and needs of others. So when these all come together, it's a pretty pathological presentation. It doesn't work well in individual relationships, and it doesn't work well in cultural relationships. And we're going to be looking a little more about how the cultural narcissism has developed. But, you know, key is that, like, I just want to look at number 4 for a minute. Lack of empathy, unwilling to recognize or identify the feelings or needs of others, or to think that others don't have the same feelings and needs. And we saw that in some of the early explanations of why slavery was okay. Even Thomas Jefferson had this treatise on how African slaves didn't feel things in the same way that white people felt things, which we know now is hogwash, but was used to justify the exploitation of his slaves, and in the time, everybody's slaves. So, okay, we can go to the next slide, which takes another dive into, oh no, so this is a map. This got thrown in here. It probably should have been one slide up, but I just saw this one recently and was pretty blown away by the visual that this presents. So Europe is the purple. So all of what we consider Europe now, and Russia. And actually, if you look really closely at South America, you see a little tiny piece of purple there, which is French Guiana, which is still part of France. So the purple is Europe, and the green are areas that were either colonized or controlled by Europe. And that's all of North America, South America, and except the part that's still owned by Europe, Iceland, all of Africa, except that little tiny orange country on the western part, which is Liberia. And then much of Asia, okay? The only countries that were never colonized by Europe are the orange ones. So that's, I have my little list here, hold on. North and South Korea, Japan, Thailand, and Liberia. Those were the only countries never colonized. And then there's some that had partial, you know, influence. And the yellow ones are, they were influenced by Europe, but not colonized. And that's Mongolia, Iran, and Afghanistan. So that's a very powerful visual, I think. But this is the outcome of the Doctrine of Discovery. Okay, next slide. All right, so I think some of you will be familiar with the work of Jean Baker Miller. She was a psychiatrist, a social activist, a feminist. She wrote the groundbreaking book in 1976 called Toward a New Psychology of Women. And she does a lot about fleshing out the pathology of dominant behavior. And her work was mostly in relationship to relationships between men and women and the oppression of women. But there's a lot of extrapolation that can happen from the micro to the macro. So we can look at this list that she sort of came up with, and also think about how is this seen now in these relationships between dominant groups and oppressed groups. So dominant behavior is given at birth by cultural standards, defines who they get to define who subordinates are. It's hierarchical and it's often patriarchal. It uses negative labels for subordinates. It sees subordinates as substandard. It sees subordinates in server roles. It sees subordinates as incapable of higher labor, thinking, or positions due to immutable factors like body, mind, race, sex. Dominants build these concepts into society through philosophy, religion, science, morality, media, education, legal systems, cultural laws, rituals, traditions. And they see their role as the way it's supposed to be, i.e. it's cultural, it's normal. Language is used to control behavior of subordinates, the labeling of people, and negative labels are given it to subordinates who stray, if they try to stray from their prescribed behaviors, then the negative labels are increased. So her work was groundbreaking. And I think if you think of this, if you've ever been aware of anybody who was in say an intimate partner violence relationship or intimate partner abuse, these are the ways that these power structures are maintained. And if we think about how Europeans treated indigenous people and how they treated, African slaves, these all apply, right? These all were the techniques or the standards for which the behaviors were perpetuated. Okay, so the next slide, please. Are just some questions I'm going to pose, and we're not going to take the time to answer them now, but at the end, hopefully we can explore some of these questions. So how do narcissistic or dominant traits of an individual affect the quality of life for their family and social contacts? And then when these same traits are foundational to a culture, what are the implications for those in power? And what are the implications for those who are disenfranchised? And then the question that we need to be thinking about on a daily basis, how do faith traditions, such as ours and others, serve as templates that disavow a narcissistic approach on either level? And think back to those first two quotations, and definitely they would disavow the predominance of narcissistic thought towards others. And as Baha'is, we're called upon to take ourselves to account each day. So even if we think we're good people, within the course of a day, we might engage in some behaviors that fit this description, even to a small degree. And we have to be constantly sort of assessing and challenging ourselves to root out all those types of behaviors. So the next slide, somebody else is going to read, number 12.
From Exploring a Framework for Moral Education by Noguchi, Hansen, and Lampel. Relations of dominance, whether of one nation over another, one race by another, one social class by another, one religious, economic, or ethnic group by another, or one sex by another, always have highly corrosive effects on perpetrator and victim alike, and essentially are violent in nature, whether or not violence is expressed on a physical level. O son of dust, verily I say unto thee, of all men the most negligent is he that disputeth idly and seeketh to advance himself over his brother. Hidden Words of Baha'u'llah, Persian number 5. O children of desire, put away the garment of vainglory, and divest yourselves of the attire of haughtiness. Hidden Words of Baha'u'llah, Persian 47.
Okay, thank you so much for reading this one. So those are Baha'i authors, and that's one of their books that they wrote together. And then the two hidden words that, again, remind us that the thinking that narcissistic cultures have is really, and especially if they use religion, as they often do, as a justification, is a hijacking of religion. It's not the essence of any of the faith's traditions, but a hijacking for personal gain. And I think we all wonder sometimes how do people who perpetuate these philosophies and the actions that go along with them, how do they sleep at night? Like, it's hard to understand that, but we are called to quite a level of consciousness that's very different and distinct. So, okay, number 13 is a visual. If we can go to the next slide. So this is just a quick visual to show that stable and just systems must balance these two things, the rights and the responsibilities. And every human being born on this planet has rights, basic human rights, just part of being a human being, and responsibilities in being as part of a culture and part of a family. And our writings tell us this too, that we have rights as a human being, as a spiritual being, and we have responsibilities towards the people whose lives we share. But people who have a dominant mindset or who are narcissistic, of course, the scale is very unbalanced, and they're all about their rights and not about their responsibilities. So, but those systems, they can seem like they're stable and they can last for much longer than we would like them to last, but ultimately they're unstable because they're not in keeping with spiritual principles, and they will eventually be self-destructive. So. Okay, number 14. Somebody's going to read the next 3 slides, which this is how these next slides talk a little bit about how the doctrine of discovery infiltrated U.S. legal and philosophical precedent in the treatment of Indigenous and African Americans. So my reader can read the next three, please.
Some U.S. legal doctrine is based on the doctrine of discovery. Various state and also U.S. Supreme Court cases cited this doctrine as precedents, frequently to justify removal of native peoples from their land and to block attempts at restoration of land, even in recent history. The U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the doctrine of discovery as recently as 2005, when liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited in 1823 case in an opinion that stopped the Oneida people from regaining lands in modern day New York.
Okay, next slide.
Manifest Destiny, a revival of the doctrine of discovery. With the opening of the Oregon Trail, the Mexican-American War, and the gold rush in California, much of the public's attention was on Western expansion. Many white Americans were eager to take more land from Native Americans, establish new territories and states, and increase their economic and political power. Three basic ideas underlie the concept of manifest destiny. First is a belief in the righteousness and superiority of the Christian moral values and institutions of the United States. The second is a belief in the responsibility of the U.S. to spread these for the benefit of the world and to fulfill God's wishes. The third is the faith that God has blessed the country to succeed, and every success confirms that blessing. The U.S. Homestead Act of 1862 hastened the long-term appropriation of indigenous land and its distribution to white Christian settlers. The act, which continued in force until 1976, distributed 270 million acres, about 10% of the land in the U.S. This Native American land was given for free in 160-acre allotments to any white person who built a house, fence, and well on the land and tilled at least 10 acres of it. Though legally open to anyone who filed the papers and made the required improvements, few white women, free blacks, Jews, or others who were not white Christian men were allowed to gain homestead status.
Okay. So we see the effects of taking this doctrine of discovery and applying it to this broad land of the Americas that was, of course, inhabited, were never really discovered because they were inhabited long before Europeans arrived. But they had the same mentality that this was God's will, that they were doing, that these people had no rights, and that, you know, they could just appropriate their land and, you know, force them onto small areas of reservations. And this was a good thing, a noble thing, not something that they should be ashamed of. The next slide, please, is a map, I think. Let's take a look at this map. Yeah, so here shows you the loss of indigenous lands. So in 1492, Europeans owned none of the land. And then by 1790, the 13 colonies were Europe under Europe's, you know, and then American control. 1830, you see it's like pretty much half the country. And this huge Western expansion, starting what we were just reading about, where one half of the country was still, you know, indigenous land, became just these few small spaces by 1890. And then today you can see that the reservations and the land owned by indigenous people is quite small. And there are efforts now for them to regain some of their land. And it's sad to know that as recently, one of the slides is 2005, there was an effort on behalf of the Oneida people to regain some of their land, and it was not successful. Next slide, please. So originally land was just given away. After a while, this poster is from 1911. So this is the year before Abdu'l-Bahá comes to visit the United States. And in this is basically an ad, land for sale, get a home of your own, easy payments, perfect title, possession within 30 days, fine lands in the West. And they no bones about it. Indian land, it's just Indian land, but it's for sale. We're and pretty inexpensive. Like here's a list of the states that they were expanding into. And, it ranged from a low of like $7 an acre to like $40 an acre. And this is the time where we're going from half the country to just little tiny pockets of places where Indigenous Americans were still able to live. Okay, next slide, please. Well, next slide is the video, I think, right? Okay, let me just give a little intro to this video. And maybe some of you have seen this, but I think it's pretty fascinating. It helps us to understand, I think, why right now we are such a deeply divided nation. And we are painfully a violently divided nation at this time. And how did we arrive at such different definitions of what it means to be an American and what version of American history is true? So this will give you a little bit of an overview of how the South, after the Civil War, how the South perpetuated what we call the lost cause narrative about Southern life and about what it meant what the war meant to them. So if we can go ahead and play this, it's 6 minutes, but it's pretty fast to watch, actually.
Listen to how this textbook describes slavery.
The master often had a barbecue or a picnic for his slaves. Then they had a great frolic. Even while working in the cotton fields, they sang songs. The beat of the music and the richness of their voices made work seem light.
Yikes, that's from History of Georgia, a textbook published in 1954 that was taught across junior high schools in Georgia for decades. That sort of language is part of an intellectual movement called the Lost Cause, a distorted version of American Civil War history that's been prevalent in the South for a long time. It took shape soon after the defeat of the Confederate States in the war, when Southern historians like Edward Pollard and former Confederate General Jubal Early started preserving the South's perspective through their writings. They framed the Confederate cause as a heroic defense of the Southern way of life against the overwhelming forces in the North. That narrative has a few basic tenets: the glorification of Confederate soldiers who died for a cause they believed in, the belief that slavery was a benevolent institution, and maybe most importantly, that slavery was not the root cause of the war. The Lost Cause is one of the most notoriously effective efforts to rewrite history, and it was done by the losing side. So how did it become so deeply rooted in Southern memory? Blame the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The UDC was founded in Nashville in 1894 to preserve Confederate culture for generations to come. The women who made up the group descended from elite antebellum families, and they used their social and political clout to spread the pro-Southern version of the war as real history. You've probably seen their efforts to honor the Confederacy, but maybe you didn't know it was the UDC. They're the ones who covered the Southern landscape with memorials for Confederate leaders and soldiers. They used their fundraising and lobbying skills to pressure local governments into erecting monuments in prominent public spaces like courthouses and state capitals.
Installed here next to the state capitol by the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
The United Daughters of the Confederacy donated this memorial to the city back in the 30s.
They put them along roadsides and in parks. Any place that was remotely relevant to the Confederacy was memorialized. By the early 20th century, the UDC had 100,000 members and chapters spread all over the country, but mostly in former Confederate states. And there's a reason they grew so quickly during that time.
So we're talking about roughly 3 decades after the end of the war, and the Confederate veterans themselves are beginning to die off. So there is this push to find ways to commemorate it, because the big challenge by 1900 was there's a new generation of white Southerners being born, and they never experienced the war years.
That push is visible. Most of the Confederate monuments were erected during the UDC's height of influence.
There's a rhetoric
around monuments, that we want to get this thing built before all of that generation has died off. And the reason we want it is to teach future generations about those men.
Dr. Karen Cox wrote the book on the UDC, and I asked her if it was fair to say the group established the lost cause as historical fact in the South.
Oh my God, yeah. They were the leaders of the lost cause into the 20th century, and they made it a movement about vindication.
Just to give you an idea of how effective they were, they successfully lobbied for a Confederate memorial in Arlington National Cemetery, which U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proudly unveiled to a cheering crowd. Now that's influence, right?
Monuments are the least of what they did.
What?
I mean, they are the most visible and tangible, but the work with children was far more influential.
It turns out a central UDC objective is shaping how children think about the war and their Southern heritage. One of their most powerful tools? Textbooks. Take a look at this pamphlet called A Measuring Rod for Textbooks. It was written by the illustrious Southern historian Miss Mildred Rutherford, an educator, orator, and author of Southern history textbooks. She's also very pro-slavery. The pamphlet announced the formation of a textbook review committee featuring prominent Southerners like 5 former Confederate generals. This group was committed to spreading the truths of Confederate history, so they instructed school boards to reject any textbooks that did not accord full justice to the South. And they urged libraries to deface every book in their collection that didn't measure up by writing the words "unjust to the South" clearly on its cover. This pamphlet was shared widely with school boards throughout the South, and UDC-backed committees closely monitored history books to make sure Northern influence never reached classrooms. So the core language of an approved textbook aligned precisely with that of the lost cause. You know, stuff like,
"The Confederacy lost in the war between the states, but Georgia never forgot to honor her Confederate soldiers."
History of Georgia was on the UDC's approved list. It was also written by E. Merton Coulter, a self-described Southern historian and historian-described white supremacist.
They understand that how you educate, who wins the writing game, who wins the battle over history, ultimately wins the war. That's the big fight for the UDC.
But their work with children went further than the classrooms. The UDC formed an auxiliary group called the Children of the Confederacy, which was designed to get kids born in former Confederate states to actively participate in their version of history. Group leaders had kids recite call and response truths from something called the Confederate Catechism. Children up to the age of 18 would compete and be rewarded for memorizing long passages of lost cause rhetoric.
So it would be like an after-school thing, you know, like that was your club. You would go after school to the meeting of the Children of the Confederacy, and your leader might teach you songs of the South like Dixie or other songs that were considered Southern patriotic songs. They would have them write essays, go visit the veterans, and learn this catechism.
Children were also the centerpiece of their community's monument unveilings, like this living flag at the dedication of the Stonewall Jackson Monument in Richmond. Yes, those are school children. The UDC's efforts shaped the identities of children who grew up with the lost cause. They made history personal, and that made their story last longer.
Generations of children learning that narrative in a variety of ways grow up to be, you know, segregationist in the 50s and 60s, because that's been drilled into them since they were children.
After World War I, the UDC started losing steam, but the damage was done. The monuments were in place, and the textbooks they wrote remained in Southern classrooms until the late 70s. And the women's group did it all without the right to vote or participate in politics.
You can still get glimmers of this lost cause memory of the war from people who will always choose to see it through the personal. And I think the UDC, to a great extent, was their goal.
So the next time someone says the Confederate monuments are about remembering our history, just know that that's exactly what the United Daughters of the Confederacy wants you to think.
Away down south in Dixie.
Okay. Let's go on just to the next slide. I'm gonna
listen to how this.
You gotta stop that. No, thank you. So just to follow up on that before we look at this slide. So we see that the Southern textbooks were consciously misleading in order to attempt to, you know, cast their leaders and their family members and their culture into a general, you know, noble place in history. I recently led a book discussion group on the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and with a bunch of therapist colleagues. And one of my colleagues was born and raised in South Carolina. And in our book discussion, she said, growing up, they never even called it the Civil War. It was called the War of Northern Aggression. And this is somebody who's my age. And that was shocking to me. I mean, of course, she's moved away from the South. She doesn't live in the South anymore. And she's also moved away from some of that education that she received, and she's re-educated herself. But it was painful for her to talk about that and to share that and to think about how far she still feels she needs to go as somebody who was raised with those ideas. But before we sort of demonize the South, I want to say that, you know, I grew up in New Jersey and I went to public school, and my own memories of what I learned, you know, were probably better than what these children were learning in the South. But so I learned that, and many people can probably relate to this, you know, I learned that slavery ended in 1865. And that, you know, that was a just war against slavery, the Civil War. But I learned nothing about the Jim Crow era. I learned nothing about lynchings. We did think that the South perpetuated evil in maintaining slavery. And to be very honest, we were sort of taught that the North was innocent and righteous. And we didn't learn about Northern slavery. We didn't learn about how Northern economies benefited from slavery. So we had a distorted version of this American history also. So I don't want to make it seem like, you know, the Southerners are miseducated and we were so well educated, because we were not. So this is something that we have to continue to improve. Okay, so this one, so just to mention that that as taxpayers, we still have to pay money to support these icons. And we know that this is right now, the ethos is changing quite rapidly. We see statues coming down, but there's much controversy. There's a lot of backlash and even loss of lives. But you know, so I forget what year this was written, but there was, you know, in the last 10 years, they said taxpayers had to pay $40 million to Confederate monuments, statues, homes, parks, museums, libraries, and cemeteries, and to Confederate heritage organizations. So it's still a liability financially to us even now. Okay, next one, I think we have some readers for.
Taxpayers still, whoops.
Oh, no, I meant to, 21, go to 21, thank you.
Sorry.
Okay.
Taxpayers still support lost cause icons. Confederate monuments aren't just heirlooms, the artifacts of a bygone era. Instead, American taxpayers are still heavily investing in these tributes today. We have found that over the past 10 years, taxpayers have directed at least $40 million to Confederate monuments, statues, homes, parks, museums, libraries, and cemeteries, and to Confederate heritage organizations.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please.
Two realities seen through different lenses. A common textbook, the Charles Grayson Summer Sills Alabama History for Schools, dismissed realities of slavery, glorified the Confederacy, and defended deeds of the Ku Klux Klan. One passage compares slavery to an early form of Social Security. Quote, with all the drawbacks of slavery, it should be noted that slavery was the earliest form of Social Security in the United States. It was the legal responsibility of the master to take good care of aged workers. It was against the law to emancipate a slave after he was too old to work. The master was responsible for looking after his overaged slaves.
Okay. So a continuation of the whitewashing of the reality of racial oppression. Next slide, please. So this is a drawing, but whoever was reading that one could please read just what the description of this drawing, please.
A drawing by Hanson Booth and the Development of America by Fremont P. Rith, American Book Company, 1937. The caption reads in part, slaves at home after the day's work was over. Negroes always have been fond of singing and dancing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. 1937 too. This, this wasn't like 1800. So, all right, next slide, please. So again, this is a voice of dissent, and many of us love and honor our Frederick Douglass, who was, an amazing orator. But in 1850, he the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had escaped slavery in Maryland, by the way, said to talk of kindness entering into a relation in which one party is robbed of wife, of children, of his hard earnings, of home, of friends, of society, of knowledge, and of all that makes his life desirable is most absurd, wicked, and preposterous. So the man had a good way with words, and he was very articulate in talking about the irony of some of the art and literature that was trying to justify slavery. Okay, next, please. So this is about the slave Bible. So I actually just really learned about the slave Bible myself, even though I've been a great student trying to study this stuff for a while. But the slave Bible was first published in 1807 by British Christian missionaries to the West Indies. And again, this is their attempt to pacify the slaves, to keep, I mean, it's definitely oriented towards maintaining the oppression. So they print this Bible, which they want the slaves to read so that they can understand, maybe they did want them to understand something about God, but a select spiritual consciousness again. And this Bible is actually, there's only a couple copies left, and one of them is on display at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., which is a privately funded museum. It's not part of the D.C. museums. And this one that they have is on loan from Fisk University. So this is a plaque from the display that they have. And it says, of the total number of verses, the slave Bible is missing approximately 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New Testament. Of the 1,189 chapters in the standard Protestant Bible, the slave Bible contains only 232. So if we go to the next slide, there's just a short video about this one too, a short little clip.
Inside Washington's Museum of the Bible, a single volume that is like no other, the so-called Slave Bible, remarkable not for what's in it, but for what's not.
So about 90% of the Old Testament's been removed and about 50% of the New Testament's been removed. To put it another way, a normal King James Version has 1,189 chapters in it. The Slave Bible has only 232.
Missing are chapters and verses that might have encouraged uprisings. Book of Exodus, redacted. No story of Moses demanding Pharaoh, let my people go. Gone is Galatians, and the verse, there is neither bond nor free, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And no Jeremiah, woe unto him that useth his neighbor's service without wages.
What they've left in are verses such as Ephesians 6:5, which is the famous verse, slaves be obedient to your master.
Looking at this Bible, it's hard to tell that anything's been taken out of it.
That's correct. I mean, it looks like a normal book. For many enslaved Africans, this would have been the first time they were exposed to the Bible.
A Bible selectively edited to instill obedience, using religion to underpin the horror of slavery. When people encounter this exhibit, what lasting impression do you want them to leave with?
But we want to pass the message on that may this never happen again. The Bible itself is a whole book. It's not one that you get to carve up and use this piece or that piece.
The Slave Bible designed to repress rebellion, but it didn't work. Enslaved people in the Caribbean constantly fought against slavery until emancipation.
I think it's very relevant to understand our history, not just American history, but our African American history, our roots and how we got to this point.
A dark chapter in the history of the good book. Jeff Bennett, NBC News, Washington.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel.
Thank you. Okay, so here we're going to get back into some of the writing. So somebody has chosen to read this slide 25, which is from Shoghi Effendi.
Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i Faith, said in 1938, "Let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, to correct their tendency towards revealing a patronizing attitude towards the members of the other race, to persuade them through their intimate, spontaneous, and informal association with them of the genuineness of their friendship and the sincerity of their intentions, and to master their impatience for any lack of responsiveness on the part of a people who have received for so long a period such grievous and slow healing wounds.
So we've read this many times. I think most of us that have studied Shoghi Effendi and his very clear instructions on what we're supposed to do. So he is asking whites to abandon their superiority and patronizing attitudes. In other words, give up your grandiosity and your narcissistic tendencies. Okay, that's kind of my translation of what that means. He's also calling on whites to understand and empathize. Okay, and remember, empathy, lack of empathy is a key component to narcissistic ideology, with grievous and slow healing wounds. Now, they didn't use the word trauma in 1938. It hadn't been really coined as the term, but in my mind and as a therapist, that's trauma. That's what Shoghi Effendi is referring to here, is that we have to have empathy towards the trauma of these grievous and slow healing wounds. And we know from trauma studies that the two components that are essential for somebody to recover from trauma are being heard and believed and being cared for. And that's what he is asking us to do here. And when, to be honest, when there's a single incident of trauma, if a person is heard and believed and cared for after the trauma, it is very rare for PTSD to develop. That PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder develops when there is no intervention following a trauma, where people get to tell their story and their narrative and then get to be heard and then get to be cared for. So there's a lot of work for us to do in regard to this. The next few slides are going to paint a picture of 1912 in the United States, what Abdu'l-Baha encountered and what the history and the politics was sort of the place where we were at as a country in 1912. So somebody's going to read the next couple slides.
Racial Realities in America in 1912, the year Abdu'l-Baha visits. President William Howard Taft was still in power in April of 1912. Later that year, Woodrow Wilson will be elected, and his record on race relations will create racial setbacks. During his first term in office, the House passed a law making racial intermarriage a felony in the District of Columbia. His new Postmaster General also ordered that his Washington offices be segregated, with the Treasury and Navy soon doing the same. Suddenly, photographs were required of all applicants for federal jobs. When pressed by Black leaders, Wilson replied, "The purpose of these measures was to reduce the friction between the races." Also, more than 60 Black Americans are lynched in 1912, part of a larger violent trend in the US, as there are nearly 5,000 lynchings throughout the country between 1882 and 1968, mainly of Black men.
Next slide. Okay, here we're going to get into the pseudoscience of eugenics. This was also evolving in the year of 1912. So I think somebody else is reading these next two.
The emergence of the pseudoscience of eugenics. The first International Eugenics Conference takes place in London, July 24th through 29th, 1912. Major Leonard Darwin, the son of Charles Darwin, was presiding. The 5-day meeting was comprised of 400 delegates, including Winston Churchill, as well as the ambassadors of Norway, Greece, and France, and a large delegation of American scientists. In his opening address, Darwin indicated that the introduction of principles of better breeding procedures for humans would require moral courage. The American exhibit was sponsored by the American Breeders Association and demonstrated the incidence of hereditary defects in human pedigrees. A report by Bleecker van Wagena presented information about American sterilization laws and propagated compulsory sterilization as the best method to cut off defective germ plasm. Eugenics stressed the superiority of the white race and that American gene pool was being polluted by a rising tide of intellectually and morally defective immigrants. It's repulsive just to read this. Inevitably, it led to racial segregation and such acts as Immigration Act of 1924 and the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. By the 1930s, eugenics had been scientifically discredited in the United States due to difficulties in defining inherited characteristics, as well as poor sampling and statistical methods. In Germany, however, the eugenics movement was just gaining momentum.
So before we go to the next slide, I just want to note here that now we're seeing the development of new tactics to enshrine the oppression that has been going on for decades. And so now we're bringing science. Of course, we know it's pseudoscience. And you're right, it's actually repulsive to read the terminology. For us now, with our hindsight, we're like, how could they even call, the American breeders, like, it sounds like what you're doing for your dogs, your canines, right? But this was very much the reality of the time and was very supported by most scientists. We now know it was quite unfounded scientifically. But the other interesting thing to note here is that Germany, so we were ahead of the game with eugenics, and of course we know how this played out in World War II with the Jews, but Germany looked at the United States to develop its policies. They looked at us for inspiration, for our attitudes towards white superiority. So then we, of course, march into Germany at the end of the war and we're the saviors, right? We're now saving, the Jewish people. And we did. I don't want to minimize that there wasn't, some honor in that. But we think when we say the word Nazi, we cringe. But we need to own our own history that preceded Nazism and take responsibility for some of the ideology that migrated back from the US to Europe, born out of these types of philosophies and education. So, okay, next slide. Next couple slides tell us the story of Abdu'l-Baha in America. And so these are a little more uplifting.
Abdul-Baha deplores American racism. He called on America to become a land of spiritual distinction and leadership, and gave a powerful vision of America's spiritual destiny to lead the way in establishing the oneness of humanity. The New York Times reported that his mission was to do away with prejudices, prejudice of nationality, of race, of religion. The article also quotes him directly. The time has come for humanity to hoist the standard of oneness of the human world so that dogmatic formulas and superstitions may end. Abdul-Baha challenged America to go beyond tolerance, to embrace diversity completely, and to demolish racial barriers in law, education, and even marriage. Throughout his US visit, he swept aside the social protocol of segregation by insisting that every place where he spoke be open to people of all races. In New York City at the Great Northern Hotel on 57th Street, where a banquet had been arranged in his honor, the manager vehemently refused to allow any Blacks on the property. Abdul-Baha remedied the situation by hosting a second banquet the following day at the home of one of his followers, with many whites serving Blacks, a subversive, even dangerous notion at the time.
Next slide.
Abdul-Baha's bold actions in the face of systemic racism. In Washington, D.C., Abdul-Baha was having a private interview with Louis Gregory at the Persian embassy. The interview, Gregory later recalled, went on and on. Abdul-Baha seemed to be prolonging it. When the planned dinner was announced, Abdul-Baha stood and everyone followed him into the dining room. Everyone, that is, except Louis Gregory. It was only 1912. Social Washington was strictly segregated and interracial dinners were not accepted. Formality had laid out 19 place settings along the sides of the long rectangular banquet table according to strict Washington protocol.
Next slide.
As guest of honor, Abdul Baha will be seated at its head. The guests took their seats. Suddenly, Abdul Baha stood up and looked around the table. "Where's Mr. Gregory?" he asked. "Bring Mr. Gregory," he told Ali Kuli Khan. Khan had no choice but to locate Mr. Gregory, whom he found trying to slip quietly out of the house without being noticed. By the time Khan re-entered the dining room with Louis Gregory, social Washington had succumbed. Abdul Baha had pushed aside the utensils, plates, and glasses that held sway over the place of honor to his right. Everyone moved over, sending a ripple of activity down one side of the table. In its place, he had laid out a 20th place setting and ordered a 20th chair brought to the table. Here he seated Louis Gregory. Abdul Baha then sat down, explained that he was very happy to have Mr. Gregory here, and, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred, began to speak on racial prejudice.
I love this story, as many of us do, and I just wish we all think we could have been like a fly on the wall to have watched that display take place and to have then studied the expression on everybody's face while it was happening. Many of you have probably heard some of the talks that Dr. Ruha Benjamin has given. She's a African-American Baha'i and a Princeton professor, and she was talking about this, and in addition to other things Abdul Baha did, and made this statement, which I love. I'm just going to read it twice. She said, Abdul Baha assaulted the oppressive racial norms with precision and grace. Okay, Abdul Baha assaulted the oppressive racial norms in the United States with precision and grace. So I love that. Okay, next slide. We are coming to the end here. I know it seems like it's going long. I think many of you have seen this visual. Again, just to remind us of where we stand on this spectrum of evolution in this country. So for, almost 340 years, there was American slavery, followed by a long period that many of us as US students learned nothing about, those years after slavery until the Civil Rights Movement. And then we're just, the Civil Rights Movement started in many of our lifetimes. Some of us were children, and we've seen some ups and downs and some progress, and then lots of setbacks. And our Universal House of Justice, writes to us frequently about what our role needs to be, and to be aware that every time we take a step forward, there's pushback, and we see that. But we also, if we remember Martin Luther King's beautiful statement that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That's a kind of a nice, hopeful reminder. So, but I think these kinds of visuals are very helpful, because you'll hear people say, "Oh, what slavery? What, that was so long ago, and how does that affect me? And I had nothing to do with it, But we need to reevaluate these realities. So next slide, please. So here's a quote I love from W.E.B. Du Bois. It was a book that he wrote called The Propaganda of History. And this is just a beautiful quotation. Where he's talking about our country. Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this, so far as the truth is ascertainable? Very poignant question. I want to just read a very short thing. If you haven't read this book, it's amazing. Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. But she does a little metaphor at the beginning about how important truth and the uncovering of truth is. And she uses the metaphor of going to get a medical diagnosis. So this won't take too long, but she's such a great writer too. I just want to read this, and then we're almost done. When we go to the doctor, he or she will not begin to treat us without taking our history. And not just our history, but that of our parents and our grandparents before us. The doctor will not see us until we have filled out many pages on a clipboard that is handed to us upon arrival. The doctor will not hazard a diagnosis until he or she knows the history going back generations. As we fill out the pages of our medical past and our current complaints, what our bodies have been exposed to and what they have survived, it does us no good to pretend that certain ailments have not beset us, to deny the full truths of what brought us to this moment. Few problems have ever been solved by ignoring them. Looking beneath the history of one's country is like learning that alcoholism or depression runs in one's family, or that suicide has occurred more often than might be usual, or that with the advancement in medical genetics, discovering that one has inherited markers for the BRCA mutation for breast cancer. You don't ball up in a corner with guilt or shame at these discoveries. You don't, if you are wise, forbid any mention of them. In fact, you do the opposite. You educate yourself. You talk to people who have been through it and to specialists who have researched it. You learn the consequences and obstacles, the options and the treatment. You may pray over it and meditate over it. Then you take precautions to protect yourself and succeeding generations and work to ensure that these things, whatever they are, do not happen again. So quite a beautiful writer. Okay, next slide. All right, there's a lot on this slide, and I don't want to go through the whole thing because of time. But this is I was in a training recently, and this young woman, Kay Cheng Tom, put this up, framework that she came up with, which I think has many overlaps with the Baha'i teachings, and love, of course, her little star there, 8-pointed. But just two of the things that I think I want to repeat, like when we talked about trauma, like recovery from trauma, you have to hear and acknowledge the person's experience, and then deliver services or help them, right? Those are the two things. So those two columns, is it honest? Like, has the whole story been told? Have conflicts of interest and power dynamics been declared? Have commitments and responsibility to self and others been carried out, etc.? That's the listening to the story. And then the kindness and the care. Is it kind? Does the action demonstrate attention to the needs and safety of self and others? Does the action invite and support positive change rather than harm or punishment, which is what we see a lot? Has there been respect for the inherent dignity and rights of all involved? So this is a very powerful little diagram she came up with, but we're not going to look at the whole thing, but I would invite you to check her out. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this was just recent guidance that we got at the Feast of Jalal this past summer from our National Spiritual Assembly, which reiterates much of what we've already explored tonight. Remember the power of humility and a posture of learning as effective means to build bonds of friendship and create environments for frank and loving consultation about race. Find practical ways to make freedom from racial prejudice the watchword in every event and occasion connected with all activities. And become more knowledgeable about the history of American race relations to better understand long-standing realities and how the faith can address them. I think, we have no excuse these days. We read, we have, we can look at websites on education. We can do virtual tours of museums, and we can't say I didn't learn enough in school. I wasn't taught. My teachers didn't understand, and it was brushed over. It was whitewashed. We really have no excuse anymore for not learning about the true history of our country. And last, I think there's just a diagram in the next one, or a little picture. Okay, so I'm just a quick thing about this, and I don't know, probably some of you recognize what this is. And I just tell a little story. When my husband and I first moved into our home, we have a really pretty little side yard as you look at our house on the left side of our yard. And it had these very nice, well, they were a couple birch trees and a white ash tree. And they were kind of crippled, these trees, because this is bittersweet. This is Asiatic bittersweet. Bittersweet had taken over this grove of trees. And, if you've seen it come up from the ground, it's like a little piece of spaghetti. It just pops its little head up. It has tiny little green leaves on it. It looks very innocent. but it has several ways of killing trees. I'll just tell you real quickly. It can cripple and kill the plants by wrapping around them. This is known as girdling. As the tree grows, the vines tighten and thin, gradually cut deep grooves in the trunk. Over time, the vine wears off the bark. It chokes off transfer of nutrients. The tree dies. It blocks light. The Asiatic bittersweet eventually overtops the tree and prevents sunlight from reaching the leaves of the tree. And it can actually pull the tree down. So it starts off as this little tiny spaghetti looking thing, ends up being harmful and oppressive and murderous to the tree. And I think of racism as bittersweet. And you can better believe, like, if we go out there and we see that little piece of spaghetti coming out of the ground, we yank it out as quickly as we can, because it starts off small and tiny, but if you don't address it, this is what happens. And life is challenged. The life of the tree is challenged. So I think we have to think of racism like bittersweet. And some of you gardeners are probably knowing exactly what I'm talking about here. So, all right, I think the next one is the last slide, which is a quote that many of you have probably seen from the Talmud, which I just love because it's so easy to be overwhelmed by the work ahead of us. But do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And that is my last slide. So I think we will stop screen sharing and have some discussion. And sorry if I went over a little bit.
No, you didn't go over at all. And I think you could have kept on going. This was just chock full of so much information. Thank you for such a clear, concise, beautifully flowing presentation. You just brought so many things together from the social sciences and from faith, you know, various religious perspectives, and it was just absolutely wonderful. I'd like to invite the friends now. Chat is going to stay closed. You can put messages in there, but they'll come to me or to Nason, because we really like to have our attention focused to one another. And if you can show yourself this evening, that would be great, especially if you're going to ask a question or what have you. I would like to invite you to consider, as part of our interaction tonight, sharing how some of this information made you feel. Not whether you knew it or not, but how did you feel about some of this? Because feeling and expressing that feeling is part of that increasing emotional capacity. And empathy is in there. So if you felt something about this, please feel free to share it, whether you have a question or not. Okay, we have a couple of hands up. I'm going to ask people to be brief, okay, because I know we're going to have a lot of discussion here. And something else that we're trying to do in this space is to encourage everyone to not do any resume sharing, okay? I did this, I did that, I've been here, you know, right? But to raise a question or a comment, ask for, you know, clarification, to share what was meaningful to you, what you can take back to your community or your personal space. So we'll start there with that. We also in this space try to maintain something of a balance. Actually, it's not a balance, to be honest, between speakers of African descent and other peoples of color and the white friends in the space. And for that reason, I may skip over the white friends and ask you to be patient. And the reason for that, if you're new to us, is because our voices typically are not heard. And so we want to make sure that the voices of the oppressed, not that we're being victims here, but that our voices are heard in this space, and that it will be useful to you as well to hear those voices. So having said that, I'm going to go in reverse order right now with the hands I see. And I'm going to start with Carla. Carla?
Oh, Rick? I
Good
think I need to put a hand up in the
evening.
top corner.
Okay, I don't see Rick at the moment, but we can try and get his hand up in there. And I'm starting with Carla.
Good evening. How are you, Kim? It's wonderful. I may have known you from back in the day when I was growing up in the New York City area.
Maybe.
Two things about your presentation that I'm not exactly certain are quite accurate. It is my understanding that Ethiopia was never run over by the Europeans, and also that prior to the Holocaust of the Jews, that the Germans first tried their experiment upon the Nama and the Herero people of Namibia. And I understand that, you know, there are some histories that we don't learn until later. So I'm just wondering if you can just address those 2 points. And I really appreciate your presentation this evening. And also one more question that may tie into this is, how might our white brothers and sisters do a better job of taking the stench of the dirty laundry of racism out when they deal with peoples of color? Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Carla. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, I'll go from the top. As I said earlier, I'm not a historian, and some of that historical information might be slightly off. I have an Ethiopian Baha'i friend, so I'll have to ask him. The map was, you know, what I didn't look for other maps. I might have maybe been able to do a little more research about how accurate that all was. But I can check that out. And I don't know anything about the Nazis experimenting. It wouldn't surprise me on other people first, you know. But I think the thing for us to remember is what most people didn't know is that the Nazis learned from us. They learned from the United States, you know. And then your question about what white people need to do, oh my gosh, that's like we need a couple hours to talk about that, right? But I think my general approach is like to be humble. I love that the National Spiritual Assembly and the Universal House of Justice encourage us time and time again to adopt a humble, they don't even say be humble, they say adopt a humble posture of learning. So that means we embody that. We don't just say it, we don't just believe it. We have to embody it. We have to show physically that we are not superior, that we don't know everything. And there's, you know what, in some ways, I think if whites could realize, white people and me included, could realize how much freedom there is in not having to be a know-it-all, like being able to just open your heart and mind and learn. Like, I think it's more fun to be a learner than to be an expert. Even though I think I have some expertise in some areas, I consider myself an expert of nothing, you know, and a lifelong learner. And I hope that that's the attitude that most Baha'is should wake up with. It's like, what can I learn today? And how can I, and of course, just listening better. That's the biggest clue too. We don't, as a culture, tend to listen. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we should listen twice as much as we talk, right? That's my philosophy. I hope I answered some of that, Carla. And I think, like I said, some of these historical things, we could all spend the rest of our lives re-educating ourselves historically and not learn everything we need to know, you know, but we should be in the process of being a student.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you both. Okay, I'm going to read the order that I'm going in right now, just so you know, those of you that have hands up. I'm going to go to Mashallah next, then Barbara, then Joa, then Gwen, and then Rick and Stella Rogers. I got you on the list. I know you had some problems getting the hand up.
Thank you.
Okay, so Mashallah, welcome. This is our designer who's been making these awesome images for us. And her mom, Demeta, if you haven't met her. Yep.
Yeah. Hi. So yeah, I'm Demeta Hicks. I am Mashallah's mom, and I'm so grateful that she's my daughter, first of all, and that she's such a blessing and a help to me. So right behind me is my painting. It's not the original one, but my painting of Mama Africa. And for me, I am really, really seeing how much I have to be committed to bringing this message of hope and truth to all of humanity. The last slide that you showed, Kim, really reminded me of the last painting that I did. It is of Mama Africa, but it's even more more visual in the explanation of how we as human beings are all connected. So with Mama Africa, I spell it differently. First of all, Mama is something that we all, I guess pretty much around the world as babies, we all say, Mama is probably one of our first words. And then Africa is spelled with free in it. So it's A-F-R-E-E-C-A. And that's because of the freedom that she represents. The freedom from oppression, freedom to see the nobility in African American people or Blacks, and us to see nobility in all people. And I think the most important thing about Mama Africa is that she represents the first mother of all humanity. So scientists say, they call the first mother mitochondrial Eve. And that's because all humanity, all of our modern humanity can be traced back to this one woman in Africa through our genetics, through our DNA. There's a marker that we all have. Yes.
Yeah. Demeta, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Well, the question that I had is basically about, all of it was really good. I thank you for that. I think the question I have is mainly about us being Baha'is. I feel like we can have the greatest impact of all people. So I guess the main thing that my daughter and I want to promote is educating and how much, let's see. So my question would be, how much do you feel that the Baha'is could really have classes or our books, perhaps, the way that the daughters of the Confederacy spread things was through children. So I'm just kind of wondering if we talked about the contributions of African American people, of Black people around the world, and all of our contributions to society, the inventions that we've created. So how much of that do you think is important to eradicating racism?
Absolutely, hit the nail on the head. I mean, we need to be doing as dedicated a job with our teachings and our core activities as those daughters of the American Confederacy did. They were very dedicated to a lost cause and to, some frameworks but look at what they did and look at what they achieved. So yeah, if we could even take a partial energy that they had in their cause and be obedient to our institutions and be involved in our core activities and be teaching children from day one about our faith, but about the history. because our schools are even now, well, we know now, I mean, we could go a whole nother session on what's happening in the schools today. It's horrendous, right? And there's such an array of what schools are doing. There's some schools that are really promoting racial consciousness, and there's some schools that are where the boards of education are being actually physically assaulted for even thinking of talking about race. So we're in a particularly difficult time, but yeah, we have to exert our efforts in this regard. We have to re-educate ourselves and our children and grandchildren. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, I'm glad you brought up those Confederate women, because I took away from that. My God, they didn't even have the right to vote.
They didn't.
And look what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Come on, Baha'i women, where are we at? Let's pick it up a notch. Get those children's class, those junior youth groups growing and talking about, the contributions of people of color. Absolutely, that's yes. That's a lesson to be learned right there. Okay, let me not go on. Barbara. Hi, Barbara.
Hello.
Hello, we got an echo with you, but we're glad you're here. You're on mute again. You're on mute now.
She's maybe shutting something off. While she's on mute, Barbara and I go back a long way. We were young moms together in Montgomery County. Many years ago. And actually, we're talking about my uncle's Institute of Healing Racism. We started a chapter, Barbara and I, and Arun. I'm forgetting his last name. Maybe you'll help me, Barbara, when you can come on. Started our own little chapter. Hey, Barbara.
Hi. We had two phones. So Radiance had one. We were all here together trying to cast it with Gil. So he's here too. So he's like, I said, Kim's on. He was like, oh, so Gil's actually listening too. Yes, Kim, I just want to say, I just really, really loved your presentation. I loved it. There were so many things that you emphasized and took some things that I know some things, but explained others. One of the things that really resonated with me was this whole thing about trauma can heal if, and I want to make sure I got the three things right, if you are heard and acknowledged, if you're believed, and if you're cared for. That was like, kind of a mic drop moment for me. I was like, because I'm always saying, do you see me? Do you hear me? Does what I say matter? But you took it somewhere deeper, that's why we're traumatized when you are not believed. So my question about that is, and I'm going to say another point, and you can answer it all together. And then you talked about the narcissistic profile. And you mentioned some things, and I hope you will remember them again, because I didn't have my paper and pencil when you were saying. So I want to write that down, because that was very powerful, because you talked about narcissistic cultures. That was kind of profound. It's like, wow, it's not just individuals, because we know that at birth we're pure and holy. And it's the enculturation of growing up, as you said, entitled, and you don't. But so I wish you would mention those again. And the third, the other thing was about the children of the Daughters of the Republic, that they actually had questions. I knew about the Daughters of the Republic, but I didn't know that they had courses specifically directed at the children, after school things, to teach them all these things, the songs and whatever it is. So as Sherilyn's saying, we got to get it moving with ours to counteract that message. So that was, because there's a saying that says, one of the Jesuit priests said, give me your child by age 7 and I'll give you back the man. And so you really brought it all together, that those first, 7 years, that's why the children's classes are so critical, because they're creating their own identity and personality. Because we know that at that point, they're in that, delta, theta brainwave state, where it's just like a computer with no virus protection. Anything that goes on. So I was thinking, so the question is, well, I wanted you to repeat those narcissistic profile, but I think about the work of Gottman, about the marriage thing, the marriage study with Gottman, and he was saying that, if your partner does something to hurt you, you need 5 things to undo it. So based on this trauma, if we can't catch it, you said if we get it, if after the first occurrence, they were heard, believed, and cared for, they could heal. What do we have to do from your perspective? Because we aren't heard, we aren't believed, and we aren't cared for. So, I mean, I'll talk to you later because did Carol call you? Did you talk to Carol recently?
My Aunt Carol?
Okay, well, anyway, I could call you, but anyway, I'll talk to you later. But anyway, could you, that narcissistic profile, can you tell me what those things were? And then how do we undo it? And how many things do we have to undo? Like Gottman says 5 to 1, if we love. What is it if we've been traumatized and continually traumatized? How do we heal this thing? Thank you, Kim.
Yeah. Wow. Lots to talk about here. Let me just review this. So if you, I mean, any of you after this can go, you can just go on Google and narcissistic personality disorders criteria. There's 9 of them, actually. There's 9 in the DSM, there's 9. The hallmarks all start with E, okay? So remember this. So and it starts with a sense of entitlement, okay? Like that you are better than, a sense of, like Shoghi Effendi says, natural superiority, like entitlement. Then when you feel entitled, you're willing to exploit others, right? Because it's your right to do so, right? You're entitled to exploit. So it's positive for entitlement, positive for exploitation, and negative for empathy. And when those 3 things exist together, you have individual pathology in relationships. Like when you have a person who has this disorder, none of their relationships work well, maybe work well for them, because they're often with this syndrome, the people are very intelligent and very charming. Okay. So it's not like you can like spot this guy walking or person walking down the street because they have this persona of charm and intelligence, but they feel entitled. So they exploit, and you can't do either of those things if you have empathy for others. You can't do those things if you have empathy. So it's those 3 things. And yes, you can see that on individual levels, family, and then it can extrapolate to the society. And of course, the Europeans, when they came here, were narcissistic. They were given the blessing by the church, right? The early colonists and explorers, the church, in the name of God, sent them out to, with a sense of entitlement. You are Christians. You have a right to do this. You have a right to take land from people. You have a right to murder people. You have a right to make them work to the, so hard that they die. That's entitlement, and exploitation results from entitlement. And you can't treat another human being that way if you see them as another human being and you have feelings and understand what they feel. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty clear-cut pathology, and it exists in individuals, it exists in families, and it exists in cultures. And the real way to start to address it is with bystanders. Bystanders have to call it out. So other white people have to call out white narcissism, because oppressed people only have so much power to do that, so and of course now as Baha'is, we're supposed to be standing up anytime we see injustice and, and being the voice of our, following the example of Abdul Baha. We have to assault the negative norms with precision and grace like he did. That's how I see it. I hope I sort of answered your question. The whole thing about trauma recovery, there's a lot of people in the field of trauma who are doing great work. And one of them is Bessel van de Kolk. And I just listened to a podcast of him the other day, and he reminded me of this little thing, like you can have somebody undergo a terrible trauma. They can be assaulted, they can be raped. But if they're believed, heard, and cared for, they're not likely going to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, how do we address generations and decades? It's much more complicated, right? But we begin by letting people tell their stories and hearing them and honoring. All relations are potentially one of recognition, honor, and then the natural result of that is compassion and love, right? Did I answer your question, Barb?
Yes, you did. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, Joa.
I wanted to first express to you, Kim, my tremendous appreciation for what you shared this evening with such a broad historical disclosure, and really a revelation to us. And it triggered a memory that I had when I was sitting in my living room in Durban, South Africa. I was living there as a pioneer. and two gentlemen with the South African Central Intelligence Agency came to visit me. I had been there and going to different townships in my service there. And they asked me a question. And when they asked me this question, I learned so much from them in that moment. And as you were recounting, you know, the doctrine of discovery and things about the history in this country, the question they asked me, they said, "Mr. Gringus, do you know where we got our apartheid model?" And I, in my blissful innocence or ignorance, it would be more accurate, they says, we developed our apartheid policy from the United States Native American policy. And the same is true for the Israeli Palestinian policy as well. And I remember going to a Redbud reservation in South Dakota, and one of the elders asked me where I'd been living. Told him I'd been living in South Africa, and he says, "Oh yes, we know all about apartheid." The question that I wanted to ask you in your work and understanding of the literature and healing trauma, from what I know about the historical precedents that have been around really for centuries on this planet, even long before the Talmud. In the Talmud, by the way, there are many statements of the superiority of the believers versus the non-believers. It's quite shocking. But we have a whole order of hierarchically and bloodline families on this planet for centuries who have been working behind the scenes to infiltrate all aspects of society, and they're on their death throes now. And so my question to you is this: you know, it's one thing to help and support the victims of trauma. Is there a literature on being able to dismantle the psychology of oppression when it's conditioned for generation after generation of child abuse, indoctrination, and so forth? Because, you know, there's two sides to every crime, really.
So, I mean, yes, I'm a very hopeful, optimistic person about human nature, a realist too, you know, but we all have the capacity to develop, to recognize our spiritual core. And we, you know, unfortunately, narcissists usually don't give up power. They don't usually wake up one day and say, "Oh, I've been a mean guy," or I would use another language, but keep it cleaner. You know, and now I'm going to mend my ways. Although I've always loved the story of A Christmas Carol, you know, by Charles Dickens with Ebenezer Scrooge, right?
Wow, yeah.
But it's interesting when you think about the story, because he gets taken back by the spirit to sort of see the history and the ideology of his own. First of all, he gets shown his own trauma, right? I forget which one it is. The Ghost of Christmas Past, I think, takes him back, and he observes himself as a young child being treated cruelly.
Yes.
And then he starts to understand the core injury. Very often there's injury at the core.
Exactly.
Not 100% of the time, but very often.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah. So actually, to be honest, all of us working on trying to develop some self-compassion would help heal the earth, because we all carry, we don't operate very well from a framework of shame. So if we can develop some self-compassion, that can go a long way. But there's stories, of course, of former Ku Klux Klan people that give up their ideology and then work for racial justice. And, you know, I think a great example is the South African Truth and Reconciliation work that was done, where perpetrators genuinely felt the pain for their victim. Not all of them, but many of them felt the pain. And that's kind of the core of restorative justice methodologies, which of course many cultures have had from the get-go, is to create safety in the community. They use restorative justice. They bring perpetrators to account, but they also recognize their core nobility and treat them that way. And when you're treated that way, again, like it sort of goes back to what Barbara was, and I was talking about before, if you're heard and believed and then cared for, even perpetrators can have changes of heart and changes of recognition of their core spiritual identity. So yes, I'm an optimist that way, but in our culture, narcissists get away with their garbage for way too long. And they have, too many people that support them in their craziness, and that's what keeps it going. It's a narcissist all by himself is not very powerful, but a narcissist with a lot of fans for whatever reason can keep going for quite a while until they can take it to their grave, and many do, sadly, Did that answer your question?
Very, very much so. And, for the sake of God's mercy and grace, let's pray that when Baha'u'llah's divine justice descends fully on this planet, that it will be greatly a mission of restorative justice and not just retribution. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, John. It was excellent. Oh, these all been excellent questions. Okay, just to go over where we are, we have Gwen and Ernest, then Rick. Yolanda put a question in the chat, and then Rennie. And maybe David. Gwen?
I'm sorry, Sherilyn. We didn't have our hand up. There's 3 Gwens, so it might be another Gwen.
Oh, no, it was you, because your hand's up right now.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
it is. I am so
But
sorry.
that's okay. We can take it down.
But
All
thank
right.
you. It was
All
wonderful.
right.
Oh, I do have one thing. Now that I thought about it, I took some notes about, especially the one video about the books in Georgia. And is that a YouTube thing, or how can we find? Is it on YouTube?
Go to YouTube and Daughters of the Confederacy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll include the links and the reference to a couple of books and folks that Kim made today. Yeah, so everyone has that. Yeah, it's a Vox video, VOX.
Okay.
Is who made that video. They're excellent. Yeah.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Gwen.
Thank
That's
you.
a great question too. Okay. Rick. Rick and Stella. Rick and Stella Rogers. Nason's trying to get you on the spotlight there. He's looking for you. There we go. You're up. And you're on mute. Keep going. Not yet. Can we unmute her, Nason? Okay, we'll wait. There you go.
Okay, Rick disappeared and he's the computer guy. I just wanted to ask you, could you please repeat?
Oops. Oh, where'd they go? Did he take them out? They'll come back. They'll come back. All right. We'll go to Yolanda's question. Yolanda, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to just read it out of the chat?
Can ask it. I didn't know if you were having questions, ask or not, but I just had a question. How do you, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but first of all, I appreciated the depth of understanding that you shared tonight. That was powerful. Thank you. And just, there were so many things and so many aha moments, and especially around trauma and healing the trauma. And so that's where my question comes. How do we allow, or do you have a suggestion on how white people can really learn to listen to us as PODI, and how they can, essentially help us to heal from some of this trauma? Because, I think what happens is when you get in certain spaces and people say or do things that put you down and cause you to feel less than, then it makes you feel as though you don't want to participate anymore because you're not being heard. And, you know, and then it kind of lends into this narcissistic behavior because you feel entitled that you can, you know, and so how do you get people to hear you? That's my question. Thank you.
So again, I think like we have this beautiful faith, and we have, you know, a real array, a real spectrum of people that come into this faith. And yet none of us, we all have to be working on our character and our actions on a daily basis. That's part of who we are. I think there are people in the Baha'i Faith that I would say are fairly entrenched narcissists. I think not as many. I mean, I grew up in the Baha'i Faith, so I didn't grow up in any other faiths, but I, you know, read about the things that go on. And I think we have safety mechanisms built into our faith with the whole administrative order. So that I think that if you have a pattern of treatment from a certain Baha'i, and you've tried to address it, and other Baha'is are not coming to the forefront and challenging that person. I mean, I think it's our responsibility to challenge oppression when we see it, and to say, you know what, I don't want to say anybody's name in case there's somebody with that name, so-and-so. You know, I really heard Yolanda trying to talk about something important to her, and, you know, I'm sorry that you cut her off again. You know what I mean? I think we're allowed to call each other out in that way, and we should. So I think there's some community responsibility to monitor these behaviors. And then I think we have this administrative order that should be working to protect people and to address, you know, it's supposed to be our catch-all, you know, elimination of racial prejudice. We are supposed to be constantly considering how we need to improve on that. And if we're not doing it in a community, then the community is, you know, not going to flourish. So I hear your frustration. I have members of my own family who I think need to go back to school and study more and learn more. And, you know, then they're good people, you know, they're generally good people, but they've got these frameworks and they don't question, they have not adopted a humble posture of learning.
And that's what, you know, I really value about learning about the Baha'i Faith, because I am, you know, new to the teachings. I grew up under that Doctrine of Discovery, if you will, in a border state, not in the deep South, but in a border state. And so with that being said, it's very frustrating to me when, you know, situations arise and people are very critical and, you know, and don't realize that things they say can be very hurtful and very painful. And, you know, and so I grew up with that, but I also grew up with, you know, a sense of knowing who I am as an individual, and that I will not be talked down to and looked down on because, or considered less than. And so that's what I have tried to instill in my children. So, you know, because I have to have a humble posture of learning as well. And so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I just want to address one thing about what you said too. So yes, like people who have been oppressed also are called upon to have a humble posture of learning, but there's something to be said for what you just, you know, talked about, like holding your head high and knowing your own nobility and expecting to be treated that way. Even you really don't have control over how somebody reacts to you, but we should teach our children to hold their heads high and to walk proudly. And, you know, when it's, you know, it's not always safe to do that as a Black child, right? Like
absolutely.
Yeah. So,
you know, I mean, I still struggle with that. My children are both adults, and my son has a business and he drives across country. And so you don't know the angst I have as a mother of a Black son who's driving across this country. And because he is a large man, you know, has the sweetest, kindest disposition, but it doesn't matter about that. He's perceived as a threat by someone, and they can make his life a living hell. And so, you know, that's just what I go through. I mean, you know, and I really stay in touch with him. I want to know, where are you? You know, I tell him, I'm not trying to blow your phone up because I know he has to sleep. But, you know, so I text him now and I say, please call me when you get to this location or when you stop, so I know that you're okay.
Yeah.
Because it's very stressful.
It is not, I have African-American grandchildren because my daughter adopted interracially. And one is a grandson, and he's 13. And
that's when this started, when he was about 12 or 13. Absolutely.
I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes in fear, and I, you know, so I can relate to some degree to your fear, and just think look forward to the day when we can send our sons and grandsons and out in the world and not have to fear for their safety. But realistically, right now, that's a real fear.
It is.
It's a real fear. I just want to say something real quick for Barbara still listening, because our mutual friend who we both loved many years ago, Fulton Caldwell. I don't know if anybody else on here met Caldwell. Okay, Fulton was a big, large African-American man. It's big teddy bear. It worked for NIH, you know, he had his doctorate and was a scientist. And I can remember him telling us, he must have been saying it in some sort of public meeting, that when he got on an elevator at NIH, he would always try to make his body smaller. Yep. Like he realized just stepping on and so here was me listening to this. I had no framework for this as a white woman. I might get scared stepping on an elevator with a strange man who I don't know, but I never would think that I would be perceived as a threat. Yet he was this gentle, sweet, wonderful, intelligent, great man. And every time he was at work, he had to be conscious of the fact that he was perceived as a threat, even in this environment of the National Institutes of Health. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
And that's so sad, because I don't want to be perceived as an angry Black woman just because I have a viewpoint that might differ from someone else.
Yeah.
But because of that, I mean, it's just like wearing my hair natural, like it is tonight. I couldn't do this when I was growing up because my mother wanted me to fit in and the society that I was in, because like I said, I was in a border state. And so, if you look too much out of the norm of what the people in that community thought was normal, then, you wouldn't get a scholarship, or you wouldn't, do the other things that she expected of us to do. And so, it just is what it is. And so now that I express who I am very freely, and I was always like that with my children, it's been, I hope that it has helped them to be their best selves. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'd like to make a couple of comments about one or two aspects of this conversation, particularly with regard to the response of the friends. Okay, when that kind of narcissistic superiority, all of those kinds of behaviors present themselves. And one, it isn't always necessarily race-based, because a narcissist is a narcissist. They don't care who they're talking to, right? So there's not going to matter. Race isn't going to make any difference. But, and that's certainly not to minimize it, adding race into the equation makes it worse for the person of color, however. Having said that, because I've asked myself many times, how do I respond to someone? Because it's so ingrained in us not to be judgmental. So how do I say something that is not judgmental to help open up this other person's perspective and help protect or honor and say, I hear you, even if, the other person doesn't, right? And I think that's a dilemma that many of us go through. It's not a free card. It's not a get out of jail card. You know, we have to practice. We have to make those efforts to step up, even when we're not sure if we're doing it in a kind but truthful way, right? I mean, that's kind of the goal, but we still have to do it. And we won't always get it right. And that's okay, because we know that's part of life's experience. We're not always going to get it right. The other thing I wanted to ask Kim is if you would explain perhaps to Yolanda about the institutional responses to things like that, when it's gone beyond a situation where it's not just a person-to-person thing, where it's a pattern of behavior that's prevalent in a variety of spaces and is affecting the community as a whole. Would you mind describing that? You know, because I don't know that she's aware of that.
Yeah, so we, you know, we have no priests, no clergy in the Baha'i Faith, and we have elected bodies. And nobody gets to be on an assembly if they try to be on. Well, you're not allowed to.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to electioneer. You're not allowed to say, I'm going to be the best LSA member, so please vote for me, because it's by secret ballot, and you know, it's people are supposed to vote for the people they think have the best character to serve their communities. So you know, that being said, in some communities there's 9 people, and so you got what you got, right? It's everybody in the town is on the assembly. And they're nascent institutions. We're you know, those of us who have served on assemblies know that we're all figuring this out as we go along, because they're relatively new. But it's a body of 9 people, and even though there's elected officers like a chair and a vice chair, and you know, nobody has any more power than anybody else, and problems can be presented to an assembly in a community. Like, say there's an example in a community where somebody is being mistreated by somebody, that can be brought to the assembly, and the assembly will consult, and everybody's opinion gets voiced, and decisions get made by majority vote as to how to deal with it. And then, you know, protocol can be developed to write a letter or go do a home visit with somebody. So it's a mechanism for problem solving that seems to work pretty effectively because of the 9. There's 9 people, and whenever you have a group of 9 people, even if it's a group that all looks pretty much the same ethnically, or you have 9 different personalities, you have 9 different executive functioning skills, set of skills. So the decisions that come out of most assembly consultations are pretty powerful and pretty effective. So that can be very helpful. And I know it's worked in some communities. But you know, this is a broad topic, and there's no easy solutions. We have to be creative, and we have to be brave, and we have to dive into the treasure trove of our teachings on how to be a community and how to be a good person.
Yeah, and the institutions are available to anyone. You don't have to be a Baha'i at all. And then there's also what we call the appointed branch, which are counselors that have a particular region, for example, of the United States, that are appointed from the Universal House of Justice around the world. We have counselors, and underneath them are auxiliary board members and their assistants. And they also are a place that individuals can go to if they're struggling, you know, with whatever, right? And maybe don't want to go to an assembly, or maybe they're, for whatever reason, or, you know, they're not nearby one or something like that. So we have these 2 independent but collaborative branches, if you will, in the faith to help the members of the community in all aspects of their lives. Yeah. Okay. All right. Rennie. I'm calling on Rennie because David always talks.
Stella got plugged in again, so.
What?
Stella got plugged in, so.
Yeah, we see
back.
that Stella's waiting.
Stella?
So we will, yeah. Stella's.
Rick and Stella. They got unplugged somehow.
Oh, they're back. Okay, I haven't seen them. Okay, good. Oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead, Rick and Stella. Great, Thank you, Rennie and David. You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Poor Stella.
I know, that's what I do.
Stella, you know.
All right, we'll go to David. Oh, no, here he comes. Okay, let's see.
No, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming.
Oh, Rick's got it.
Okay.
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 Yeah. Okay, great. I don't know how to control. Maybe on this computer, I don't know. Anyhow, we ran out of battery before. The reason my hand popped up was I wanted to ask you if you would please repeat the quote about Abdul Baha from I don't remember her name.
Yeah.
I
think I know it by heart. It's Ruha Benjamin. She's amazing. If you must listen to some of her tapes and stuff that she does. Of course, now I'm not going to be able to find my paper. She said Abdul Baha assaulted the racial norms with precision and grace.
Yeah.
With precision.
That pretty much covers my very short question.
Which was saying?
Yeah, that's such a beautiful quote.
She is an amazing presenter. So go and see what you can find.
I'm gonna look for her.
Has she not been provided you any? She's been invited to speak? Oh.
No, I didn't know about her until you mentioned her. How do you spell her first name?
Ruha. Ruha Benjamin. She's African-American and Persian. And she's a Princeton professor, which is a
excellent. Great.
And the last name ends with I-N?
Benjamin.
Okay. You asked for responses to Kim's talk. Kim, I thank you.
Oh.
This has been just mind-blowing and eye-opening and heart-wrenching experience. I had no idea. I had never heard anything about the doctrine of discovery, which perhaps is better named the doctrine of the 7 deadly sins. And I really look forward to when your presentation gets posted and I can go through it and get the quotes. And yeah, thank you all very much.
You're very welcome.
Very welcome. Stella, before you go, what do you think you'll do with this information now that you've had this? I know you're going to go back and look at the YouTube video. Does this spur you to take some action?
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the action's already happening. It's in your heart. That's the first step.
Processing right now.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're a treasure. Okay. All right. Okay, where's Dave and Rennie?
Well, I know I speak for Rennie, but I shouldn't, but our minds are blown by this wonderful presentation. You have done your homework, lady. This is tremendous. We all are just beginning on this road. There's so much to uncover. But my question was, could you make the slides from your just those quotes? You have so many wonderful quotes that I have not seen before, and exposing the daughters of the Confederacy and all their work that they've been doing. I really would appreciate if that was made available, just the quotes. It's kind of hard to, you've got videos in there too. But
we can work on that.
Yep,
okay,
we can do that.
And
we'll send them out.
Landon's going to give us some links, so that's good. And for Joa, Lies My Teacher Told Me, and Lies Across America, two incredible books. Every white person should read those.
Thank you for that. I actually, in one of the iterations of this, I actually included that. So, and I took it out this time to shorten, but I want to pay homage to James Lowen because he just passed away recently. And yeah, and his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, came out, I want to say his first version was in the 1970s. So he was definitely ahead of his time. And he postulated, and I kind of agree with this, that when you think about how much most kids hated history in school, he says it was on some level, they know they're being dished out a bunch of malarkey.
Exactly.
And that's why they detest it, because it's like there's something inside them that's just saying, no, something's wrong. I smell something funny here, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, he's great, James Lowen. Quite an icon.
It's a whitewash, and truly a whitewash. It's been whitewashed. Oh, thank you guys. Okay, Rebecca and Raven. Hi, guys.
Hi, you get me tonight. Kim,
Yes.
Kim, thank you so much for this presentation. You put a few things together for me. Barbara Talley and I both hooked on to very similar things. However, it sort of surprised me as she was talking about how do we deal with the trauma, and I understand that from the pupil of the eye perspective. But when you were talking, I thought you were talking to me. Shoghi Effendi is talking to white people about their response and their lack of patience to the slow healing wounds. And when you named it trauma, it really clicked in for me, sort of an aha. How could I expect anything less? And if it's trauma, if we were driving down the road and we witnessed a car accident, we would all get out of our cars. We would all go start trying to do triage. We would all be on the phone to 911. This is a call to white people. And I really want to reiterate that in this room. That's who that's talking to. And I just, when you said the trauma, for that trauma to be heard, for those slow healing wounds, and I wrote it down, need to be heard and believed, and then to be cared for. It tells me as a white person that to be heard means I have to stop talking and do deep listening and get over my impatience of you're not saying it in a way that's suiting my stance of this is the level that we're all supposed to be talking out. This is the assumption. I'm running under this assumption because my assumption is probably wrong. So you really clicked this in for me. And to be heard means to do the deep reflection after the talking takes place. Not just say, oh, I get it before somebody, but go back and really reflect on it. And then to be cared for. And I think in hearing and being believed takes that fight out of us for us, and again, takes us back to reflection. And those are caring acts. And then to step up in meetings when we see more trauma being inflicted. This was just, by naming it the name, it's like the magic spell is broken. It's trauma, that's what it is. So awesome, good on you. Thank you. And also you said something I thought was so important that I just, and I wouldn't mind if you spend a little time with this, and then I do have one question, is you had a model of a balance, and it was stable and just systems of balance. And there was rights on one side and responsibilities on the other. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that. And I think that may be also a little bit of Yolanda's sort of questioning of our, how in a Baha'i community, what are our rights and what are our responsibilities to our fellow Baha'is? My bigger question, if those hopefully will go through good, You said the word selective spiritual consciousness. So what could you expound on that? And how does that relate to the Baha'i communities of today, or does it?
Oh, I think that can relate to some communities and maybe a little bit, to some degree, a little bit to all communities. It's like, but I wanted to go and find the quotation, and maybe somebody here knows it or can find it. I mean, there's a very specific quotation where it says, don't think you can pick and choose from these teachings what suits you. You know, like, I mean, I think all faiths have taught that basically, but like we have it, like it's from the pen of Baha'u'llah. I think it was Baha'u'llah, not Abdul Baha. You know, like we can't indulge in selective spiritual consciousness. We cannot, like, you know, pick what feels right and easy for us to do and natural. I mean, there's some things, like, we're all born with some natural qualities, right? Like, some of us are just a little more patient than others. But, you know, it's not about like going with the flow. Like, that's not what it means to be a Baha'i, right? It's constant, diligent effort at overcoming your shortcomings and recognizing them first and then overcoming them. And so that's like a spiritual inventory, you know?
Yeah.
Like I said, there's like, who wants to be the expert? Like, I think part of getting older, there's such relief in like, I don't have to be perfect. Like there was one point in my life where like, if I wasn't perfect, I think I covered it up with shame and all sorts of things. And it's like, I don't have to be perfect. I know that now. And I'm just gonna work. I want to be a worker bee, you know, make me a worker bee. I don't want to be the queen bee, you know, but it is work, but it's exciting work, right? It's like, why should we be afraid to dive into our dark side? Why, like if we're basically at the core good people, and that's what we're told, that, you know, we have gems of inestimable value, then we should have the bravery to say, you know what, I was short-tempered with my grandson yesterday, and I owe him an apology, or I need to spend a little extra time now nurturing that relationship, you know. So I don't know, am I getting off key here with what you asked? I think
I don't think it's off mark, because you were explaining, I needed more explanation of how you were referring that to.
Right.
And I think also it was sort of wedged between Doctrine of Discovery and the hijacking of religion.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like, whoa, what? These are amazing concepts to me.
Well, even nowadays, when you hear what some Christians say is the Christian thing to do, you're like, do you know the Jesus I know? Have you read the stories about Jesus that I've read? Like that whole thing, what would Jesus do? Like, some people come up with the craziest ideas of what they think Jesus would do, right? And that's not just for the Christians. Every faith has people who, you know, are hypocritical, or, you know, don't really dive into the spiritual essence of what they're being taught, you know. But what we've done in the name of religion to each other is horrendous at times, I think.
Thank you, guys. Quick plug, if you're new to us, and I know a few of you are, I want to say hello to you, Shin Kui. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Shin Kui Shen. She's in Madison. Hello. And Lynn Kelsey. Oh, any relation, I wonder.
Cousin. First cousin.
Yes. Okay, Francis, William Lamb, Jackie Newberry, Nan Yuma, Ursula Herman. It's great to have you guys here. And some old friends. Hazel is here tonight, as well as a few others. Well, everyone's a friend. But I also want to take this time to invite you, if you're not already subscribing, to be notified about our upcoming presentations and when they're available on YouTube. Please just, you can put your name and email address, city and state in the chat, and I'll add you to our subscriber list. Or you can send an email to rhrj19@gmail.com, and I've put that in the chat for everyone. So we have Hoda left, and then after Hoda, I'm going to invite anyone that hasn't spoken today, especially, let's see, if there are still friends here that are on their phones. Yes, we have a couple of people here on their phones, and I don't think they're able to raise their hands. So Hoda, and then after that, we'll open it up to our friends on the phone if they would like to make a comment or have some questions. And then I think we'll wrap it up for this evening. I know we could go on a long time. This has really been an excellent conversation. Hoda, so good to see you, my dear.
Good to see you, Charlene. And really, thank you so much, Kim, for a really, really wonderful, comprehensive presentation. I wanted to ask you a question. And I guess you've been around specifically the Iranian Baha'is for a long time because you're second generation Baha'i. I wanted to ask you if you were going to give this, third generation.
Fourth.
If you were giving
great grandmother.
Fourth. All right. If you were going to give a talk to a group of Persians, what would you be talking about in terms of characteristics, behaviors, attitudes that they should be mindful of? And because I want to be honest with you, the slide that I could identify ethno-racially most was a pathology of dominant behavior. Given at birth by cultural standards, hierarchical, patriarchal, using negative labels, which is a lot of othering we do culturally, seeing subordinates as substandard, something that, this belief in this Aryan myth that, it's been perpetuated since the 1800s, seeing, and just coming over here, coming to the United States and seeing the racial divide, the two Americas, and, who you have to be hanging with in order to make it, and who you have to step over in order to be considered just as human as whiteness itself. So that's the particular question. And honestly, the narcissistic personality disorder, brilliant. So I would just wanted to say, having had that proximity with, specifically Iranians, have you thought of other things, other psychological phenomena that kind of help us understand ourselves so we can get rid and weed out those inherited tendencies we have inherited from two nations that has strong anti-Blackness sentiments in Iran and in the United States? Thank you.
Okay. Tough question. Now I have, especially when I lived in Maryland, those were communities that were very high percentage of Persian believers. So I'm struggling a little bit with your question because, and you have more of an insider's view, I think, but as a person being within a community, I've had such an incredibly broad range of experiences with my Persian friends, like from most angelic people I know to people who I think have some homework to do, right? There's a whole spectrum, but incredible qualities of generosity, like just some stellar qualities that stand. Like I wouldn't feel like I could tell the Iranian Baha'is what they need to do. What I want to say, but let me say this, and I might have said this in another presentation that I've given before. At least, and I don't know too many Iranians that aren't American Iranians, right? That aren't here in this country, because I've never traveled to Iran, and I've actually never lived outside the United States. There's a lot of depression and unhealed trauma in the Iranian Baha'i community. And that's, if there's any message that I want to give that as a broad statement about the Iranian Baha'is, it's that they need to, the whole thing about self-compassion before, like they need to have more compassion for their own trauma histories and name them and claim them and not be, and I think there's a high level of shame around the trauma. And that I think is a barrier, but it sounds sort of cliche, but some of the finest people I know are Persian Baha'is, so, yeah. So is that helpful? Is that?
Thank you. Actually, it was very, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Chiqui. Hello.
Hello. Sorry, I raised my hand last minute.
That's
yeah,
okay.
I appreciate seeing your presentation. It's really like inspiring, and also I feel like I have a lot of homework to do as well. I was sharing with my friends some of the key points you brought up, and also some of the points our audience brought up about how, like a Nazi, how like South Africa, the policy kind of inspired by the conception of race, like especially the, I guess, white supremacy in the States. And one of my friends, she's saying actually a lot of like harm or a lot of, I don't know, crimes they committed, they're done by the locals now, cannot be traced back to like white supremacy. But I don't know how to respond to that kind of remark. I just like I guess I need some help kind of to address that kind of sentiment. Like people kind of deny that we can trace these, I don't know, like phenomena or injustice back to the systematic, I guess, notion of whiteness. So I would appreciate any thoughts or feedback. Just help me to start a dialogue with my friend. I'm not saying I need to shut her out, like shut her out or something, but like I want to start a genuine, like authentic conversation with her.
No, I think your dilemma is a common one among many people with their friends and family, you know, different levels of understanding of sociological factors that lead to certain conditions, you know, so, and I don't know that I think it depends on the quality of the relationship. I often think the best way to address these things is with questions yourself, like questioning them, like posing a question about, you know, what do you think, might be underneath but like asking people to sort of examine why they think certain behaviors that they observe are a social reality. Like what, like, because we can't really lecture our friends. Like we're not going to get anywhere if we do that. We have to have that humble posture of learning, because if we adopt that holier than thou, then we're just being narcissistic in the moment, right? We're doing our finger shaking and lecturing, but I don't know, maybe this might be a good question to turn over to others, Sherilyn, because I don't think I have all the answers to that.
You were reading my mind. You know, we got a lot of brain power in here in the room still. So come on, folks, let's pitch in, help Shin-Kui out and help ourselves out at the same time. So what do you do? I mean, I personally, I would have said kind of the same thing that you did, Kim, so if they said, well, Blacks are this or this or that, or Native Americans, whatever, I say, oh, why do you think that? And listen. And in my mind, that's kind of how I think Abdul Baha would have done it. Because he always listened. He let people empty their cups. Mm-hmm. And then you have an understanding of why they're thinking the way they are. And you've also demonstrated a genuine interest in their thoughts. And that creates a bond. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, obviously, right? And then you can decide, okay, what's the best point of entry to kind of turn the ship a little bit, right? What's the one thing that comes to mind, or maybe it'll come to you later on. Like, oh, you know what? That was so interesting what you said the other day. And in fact, I went and looked it up, and look what I found. What do you think about this? And show them whatever you found and have a discussion. Oh, well, that textbook was written in Georgia, 1954.
Yeah.
So I think questions are such a valuable tool that we underutilize, because questions say, I want to understand, and I want to understand you. And our stance in that humble posture of learning is not judgmental. It is to listen, it is to understand. And people appreciate that and they feel accepted. I would totally go with the question. Lynn, that's all I've got. Sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
It seems that you've said a couple of times that trauma is found in more than one culture. And so I think that it's maybe truth, just being real about it, that we all have something in our, maybe in our DNA that is carried over. And it's the empathy that we have for one another, the ability to recognize that suffering is not limited. It's sort of, in the world we live in today, oppression is, as you showed on that map, that colonialism pretty much covered the globe, that the entire world, there are people from all over the planet who have experienced this. And so when your friend localizes it to just the people within, her vision, maybe you might remind her of where, did your people come from a place where they suffered? And can you relate to it in that way? Because oftentimes when nothing else works, that does. Maybe Kim could explain why that is.
No. I do agree.
They're only second cousins.
Yeah, no, first.
Oh, first, okay.
Her dad and my mom, siblings, yeah.
Okay.
I do agree that there's too much trauma in the world. And it's interesting when we think of trauma, like we think of, okay, like, a natural disaster, like that's a trauma. And people get killed and hurt and lose loved ones, and it's very traumatic. But trauma at the hands of somebody who's supposed to care for you is 10 times worse, okay? Even if the injuries are fewer, like say you're supposed to be cared for by a parent and they are cruel to you either verbally or physically, and you don't get as injured as you might if you got hit by a car. It's a more traumatic experience to have those, again, thinking back at the scale, rights and responsibilities, right? Like, and Abdul talks a lot about family rights and responsibilities and says that nobody's rights within the family are unimportant or can be dismissed. So, but there's way more trauma in the world than there needs to be because of how we treat one another. Like all trauma is not avoidable. I mean, all of you probably had some sort of a fairly serious accident at some point in your life, either a fall, a broken bone, a car accident. We will all have, most of us will have some form of trauma, physical trauma in our lives. Our bodies are, prone to accidents and disease. But the type of trauma that we need to be, like if we start building stronger communities and stronger families, there will be less trauma. Because much trauma, like actually, I mentioned Bessel van der Kolk before, and he started originally working with Vietnam veterans and, was very sensitive to their trauma. He said, but for every Vietnam veteran, there's 30 kids who are abused in their homes. And they're not making headlines and they're not getting a lot of money put towards their trauma. Like I'm not saying veterans they absolutely deserve good treatment, right. But the VA's got a lot of money for trauma work, and abused kids. You try to find a child therapist right now. It's almost impossible because of COVID and long lists. And so there's a lot we can do to ameliorate and prevent trauma if we start caring for one another, right? And listening to each other's stories.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that? On that topic? Okay, I'm going to share screen for a second because I found this. Someone's going to speak?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Shipui.
No, I just want to bring attention. I think
David, you said?
Yeah, David.
I just wanted to say that a good question, a good intervention question is a little ironic humor. You say, when did you first decide to become a white male? Or why do you think that person decided to be Black? It's a way to intervene in these tense, bizarre reactions that some people have.
Let me just add a quick thought. thank you so much for like your generosity, like so generous your feedback and comments. I feel like it reminds me of the recent message we got this year. It says, I think towards the very end, it says we need to find the precious points of unity. I feel like it's so important. And like, as we see, I guess how much turmoil we have in society across the globe, it's really, I think we are called to reflect on ourselves. Like I think to a greater extent, it's actually about self-reflection in the first place. And then I guess show a genuine interest, like you mentioned. Sorry, I need to shut. Okay, like you mentioned, I feel like it's really spot on. Like if we are not interested in other people's thoughts, like the other people might not feel they're accepted, and there will be no bound. Like we need to feel safe, to feel connected, in order to engage in the conversation, and that's what Public has modeled for us. So he's the perfect example. Yeah, I feel like on this special occasion, special day, is like the perfect timing to look at this issue. So thank you.
Good, good. Okay, thank you, Shikwi. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
It's Shitsi.
Okay,
think about
we'll
cheese.
practice.
Think about
Okay.
cheese, like because I'm
Well,
in Wisconsin.
Okay, yeah. I'm lucky to have her in my next door community out here in Wisconsin. So we'll get to practice our names when we see each other again. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, any other comments or questions? Anyone on the phone? I know a couple of the phones are still with us. 505-670. Okay, Rebecca has raised her hand. Rebecca? Oh, Raven, go ahead. Great.
There we go. Hi, I want to join in the chorus of appreciating you, Kim, for a very wide-ranging and dense talk. And I wanted to pick up on sort of the last thing, the undercurrent of what I was hearing. And part of it is that I did study curriculum. And when you talk about history, you're talking stories. And some stories are based in fact, and the Daughters of the Confederacy started spreading a story that wasn't based in fact. But the story was spread and the story was put into curriculum, and you learn what's in the curriculum. You learn the stories you're told, and you don't learn the stories you aren't told. I mean, that may seem obvious, but if you're not told about the Doctrine of Discovery, you can't learn it. It's not there in the world. And I think of, you started with the story, or this session started with the story of Abdul Baha and Louis Gregory, and inviting him, and that, you know, that sort of the fierce protection of what's going on. And I'm thinking of, in response to Shitsi's question, that stories, when you're talking with family and friends, you have common stories or common history, or at least common events, although you may have interpreted them quite differently. But there is a sort of commonality you can start with, and then you can expand and say, you know, I was thinking about it this way, or I met this my new friend Sherilyn, and here's an interesting story that made me think of that time that we had in common and things. So that story is such a powerful way of teaching and learning. And I'm so glad you hit on it, because really the facts about the Daughters of the Confederacy and their work in curriculum, and the echoes that resound, not just in the South, but here I'm in the North, in Northern California, and those tropes and those lessons are being enculturated. And it is, you know, it's easier to teach someone new than to teach someone how to unlearn something wrong and then teach them something new. And it's just so, it was marvelous how you put it together, and thank you for educating us.
You're welcome.
Okay, last call, folks. Nason and Jillian have showed up.
Okay.
They're the ones.
Hello, my name
Oh.
is Verdina, and I'm from
Hey.
Virginia. And I'm just delighted with your presentation, Kim, and thank you, Sherilyn, for inviting her, and really found a really deep insight from your brilliant presentation. Thank you. And I will watch it again on. I'm glad I didn't miss it tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Berdina.
Yes.
It's lovely.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Glad you made it, Bertina.
Mhm.
Good to
Yeah.
have you here. Wonderful. Okay, anyone gonna take us out? Whenever Jillian and Nason show up.
Oh, Sherilyn, if I say one thing.
Absolutely.
Something that I was thinking about that works for me when I talk to people. I find that when I say, that has not been my experience or my understanding. What have you experienced to make you think or feel that way? Because I haven't seen it. And that usually causes a conversation 9 times out of 10 that comes out and it changed my thinking, because I have personal experience that counteracts what their thought, like, I don't know, experience from not being educated, because they don't have experience. If you think that way, there's not experience necessarily involved there, and that changes the thought process. So that's just something that's been helpful for me.
That's great, Jillian. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful.
It sure is. That sure
very,
is.
Very non-threatening. You know what? Very non-threatening way to deepen the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad we record this. Because there's always gems like that, right? Yeah. Okay.
I just have one thing to say that, if I may.
Please, Aruna, wonderful to hear from you. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say about what Hoda brought up, something I'm not sure I quite understood her question, but Kim's response. But what I would like to say is Kim's response was from a perspective of a white person, as how a white person would be treated by Persians, as opposed to how perhaps other people would be treated.
Thank you, Aruna. Joa, is your hand up?
Yes, just to be succinct, the problem with history, as one teacher once explained to a group of people listening, is that history is his story.
Okay, we're going to give you points for that, Joa. Oh. Stella?
When I first read the Kitab-i-Iman, I got so excited with the recitation of the history of the manifestations that I'd never heard of before. And I ran into the room where Rick was and I said, Rick, this is history. And he said, it's his story.
With a capital H.
Yes.
I think she's got you on the leaderboard, Joa. That was really good. Capital H. H-I-S.
Yes.
Awesome. You get finger snaps for that too. That was so good. For those of you that don't know finger snaps, that's a sign of it's like clapping, but in a quiet way to affirm what someone's doing, that you really like it, that kind of thing. Yeah. So yeah, great. All right. Yes, that and that too. Yes. I call that the fast Diana wave. It's like the Queen wave, but it's fast. Okay, I'm getting silly now. It's time for me to go, if not you guys. So thank you so much, friends. It has just been absolutely lovely to spend this evening with you and to converse with all of you. Our last presentation for the year is December 11th. You'll get the announcement. It's Nancy Ewing. And let me tell you, this is one of the most fantastic, I mean, all of our presentations are fantastic, but this one is very interactive. Okay. You're not going to get sent off into breakout rooms, you know, but we're all going to be interacting in this presentation. I can't tell you any more about that because it unfolds, you know, right? I can't divulge anything, but I encourage you to get December 11th on your calendar. The Zoom link is the same. The announcement's already on Facebook. Share it with your friends, your family. It's going to be so engaging. There is, as always, that educational component and a quite stimulating way of analysis and coming up with solutions. That's all I can say. And I may have said too much already, but I really, really, really want to encourage you to come. It's just going to be so much fun. Okay, well, thank you so much, friends. We love you. We see you. We believe you. And again, thank you so much. You've made my weekend. Have a great weekend and a great couple of weeks until December 11th. Aloha. Thank you so much for coming.
Bye.
Good night.